Chapter 23. A Déjà Vu of Sorts. Daria took point in deciding how to best go about scouting the small village, and we definitely didn't complain, seeing as how she was way better equipped for all the stalking and sneaking about. Her first order of business was to do a complete circuit of the clearing, staking it out from all angles, looking for possible surprises and life signs. Lyle and I were just supposed to sit tight, ready for anything, and in case of trouble, make as much noise as possible. Since as much noise as possible was more or less modus operandi for Lyle and I on our outings to date, I felt supremely confident in our ability to do just that. This left the two of us waiting about 40 minutes, fully attentive and with our eyes on stalks for the least bit of movement or noise. But nothing happened. I did almost soil myself when Daria returned to our hideaway, but that was beside the point. She calmly gave her report. No movement or signs that anybody had been passing through the nearby forest lately, and there was nothing to be scouted from within the clearing either. She'd spotted one single track, this one a bit fresher and easier to read, with multiple footprints, meaning humanoids, leading away from the clearing in almost the opposite direction that we had entered. She couldn't conclude whether that meant that our prey had come and gone, but we wouldn't be able to tell for sure without investigating fully. With that, we cautiously moved inside the clearing, Lyle in front, shadowed by Daria on the right and me on the left, a couple of meters back. Our path might have seemed haphazard or indirect to the uninitiated, but we had decided to check out all the buildings first before moving towards the center of the clearing. I, for one, had seen too many movies where our heroes were daft or headstrong enough to move straight for the center of town where the enemies obliged them by pouring out of any building. So yeah, checking the buildings first seemed like the way to go. The buildings were quickly ruled out as ambush points, and we ended up approaching the center, more relaxed now that we'd determined that we weren't about to be pincushioned by waiting archers. I spoke without thinking. "Guys, this is a hole in the ground." Lyle nodded in agreement, wrinkling his nose in disgust. "Yeah, seriously. Everything's rotten, and it looks like it was abandoned years ago or more. We are definitely not going to find anybody here." I grabbed him by the shoulder and pointed at the structure embedded dead center in the clearing, a crude stone staircase heading almost straight down into the earth. "No, seriously. There's a hole in the ground right there." The staircase to hell just sat there, promising doom for anybody daring to trespass. Somebody might claim that I was being overly dramatic over a silly stare, but in that case, they hadn't been exposed to many games or movies. The lintel surrounding the staircase was portrayed as the open jaws of a giant gaping dragon with huge fanged teeth. As it was the only decoration of any kind we'd seen on any of the structures in the building, it just oozed, "Pray, enter. We have cultists, traps, and snakes galore. Come for the adventure, stay for the blood sacrifices." Maybe my imagination was overtly vivid, but it was that kind of entrance. A short discussion later, and we'd agreed to do a more thorough search of the surrounding buildings in order to try and assess just what we were getting ourselves into. We reconvened a quarter of an hour later in front of the staircase, and Lyle was the first one to speak up. "I stick to my first comment. This seriously is a hole in the ground. Everything's busted or rotten, and it was clearly abandoned ages ago." I truly couldn't fault him for that impression. It was obvious that the place had been abandoned for years, maybe even decades, and nature was trying to reclaim everything with waist-high grass and shrubs everywhere. Even so, the buildings and furniture that had been left behind were plainly of a shoddy make, constructed with a disregard for drafts, holes in the walls, straight angles, or similar minor concerns. The clearing had held 12 buildings, 2 of which had already collapsed. I piped in. "Agreed, it's a dump. Something feels a bit off to me, though. First, proportions. Whoever lived here must have been pretty small, all of them, Nothing taller than gnome size, as far as I could tell, right? Next, 12 buildings altogether, and of those, 3 were dormitories, 2 smithies, 1 carpenter, 1 classroom, and, let's see, 5 unknowns? Daria cleared her throat.
3 unknowns. 1 looks like a boyer, I recognize the workbench, and I believe the largest one was a mess hall. Large table for serving, smaller tables with benches for eating.
I nodded to myself, half lost in thought. Sounds about right. But then what about that oblong building where they've dug down to create something that looks, well, like a swimming pool? At that, Lyle snapped his fingers and exclaimed, "That's it! Arcangelo, they were kobolds!" The words gushed from him, as if to forestall us from disagreeing. "You both know Greg, right? Well, even with his problems and all, he still always goes for a swim every single day. Chertog told me once that it's because his species is half ground, half sea people, or something along that line." Daria raised an eyebrow and ventured,
Amphibian?
Lyle looked as blank as a teenager hit with a pop quiz after a hard night of gaming, so I jumped in to save him. It would explain a lot, really, including that ugly mug at the staircase. But then, what the hell were at least 50 kobolds doing in the middle of the forest? And with no regular housing and just what looks like a work camp or pits. A war camp? We all pondered that for a bit in silence. But in the end, I stood up from where I'd been resting and rubbed my hands together. All right, we're not going to have all the answers, but we know a bit more now. As for tactics, I propose that I go first with Lyle close behind me and you in the rear, Daria. I know, I said, holding my hands before me in order to preempt any complaints. I'm not sneaky by any means, but I do have a couple of decent stun spells in case of surprises. And also, I've spent a fair amount of time recently spotting kobold traps in underground tunnels. At this, Daria shot me a look I couldn't quite decipher. Curiosity, maybe? Whatever it was, for once she didn't look hostile, and only nodded her consent. I turned to Lyle and gave my sternest impression. And you? Same agreement as our earlier outing, all right? If things look like they're about to go south, I'll cast Minor Haste on you, and you run for Grant's Crossing. No hesitation, no heroics. Agreed? Lyle gave an earnest nod, and for Daria's benefit, I added, while it'd be a major pain in the ass for Daria or me to fall in battle here, it'll only mean a temporary inconvenience for us. You, on the other hand, are not an expendable resource. Lyle blushed, but it looked like he took it to heart, which was exactly what I was aiming for. I really didn't want to explain to his dad how he'd fallen in battle. There was only one additional subject to discuss before venturing down. Light. Already from the top of the stairs, I could tell that it was going to be as dark as sin, and it didn't look as if Exogenics had been kind enough to include fluorescent mushrooms to illuminate our path. Daria volunteered her help, and within a quarter of an hour, she'd manufactured a bundle of homemade torches that should provide decent light without too much smoke. Naturally, this meant painting one big damn target on ourselves for any mean-spirited creature with dark sight that might be lurking down there, but it wasn't to be helped. Lyle decided that he'd likely be able to maneuver decently with a torch in his shield hand without burning himself, and with that, we entered the maws of the dragon, or kobold, most likely. It was slow going. With my earlier experience from the Bard class quest, I distrusted every damn fixture inside the tunnel and went as slowly as needed to feel pretty certain that we weren't going to get slaughtered by my lack of attention. The stairs went down for at least 20 meters before petering out into a familiar-looking tunnel with a downward slope. The familiarity was easily explained. The dimensions and style looked exactly the same as during the Bard quest, and served to increase my paranoia. Things went entirely without any incidents, right until we neared the first chamber. The chamber itself was also similar to the ones I'd passed, with a couple of notable exceptions. No helpful texts, no kobolds, no traps, and most importantly, 3 exits sprouted from the chamber, one for every point on the compass. At this juncture, I was left scratching my head and asked Daria if she could help with any tracks. She spent a couple minutes crawling about on the floor and then returned to us for a whispered conversation.
I am fairly sure that the paths to the north and west have been left almost untouched for quite some time. The eastern tunnel, on the other hand, looks like it has seen some use.
I thanked her and asked, "All right. I'm well aware that this might be a huge waste of time, but do we dare leave those 2 tunnels unexplored? Anybody opposed to spending the time to make sure our backs are free?" There were no takers, and shortly I was shuffling forward westwards through a mostly undisturbed layer of dust, with a number of footprints going each way to disturb the monotony of the seemingly endless tunnel. 5 minutes later, my paranoia finally paid off. I'd noticed something that looked like a mural on the left wall and, of course, wanted to investigate. I took my time, however, and managed to stop in time to notice a number of incongruities on the rightmost wall, a couple of lines of about a meter of length, each placed at ankle and waist level, where the mortar and the brick wall seemed to be missing. Holding up my hand to stop the others, I slowly inched forward, scanning from left to right. I failed to spot anything which might trigger whatever lay hidden behind those lines on the wall, and waved Lyle forward a bit to help with the light. A bit later, I took a closer look at the floor on the other side, where a number of bricks had been placed slightly out of key with the surrounding ones, fiendishly placed just where one might stand to take a closer look at the mural on the wall. Once I'd assured myself that no other traps were nearby and warned the others off, I took a closer look at the murals. It was pretty basic stuff, really. Some kobold guy on a throne points his scepter at a bunch of grouped kobolds. Kobolds go forth en masse, creating homes everywhere they went, and there was much rejoicing. By the kobolds, at least. We moved onwards, careful to stay to the right side of the corridor. Unfortunately, that was all. 50 meters down the corridor, it was a dead-end alley. No treasure chests, nothing. Just a full stop. We returned to the original chamber and took the northward tunnel, intending to explore every option before venturing into the place where our quarry was supposedly lurking. The result was only slightly different: another dead end, another trap. Also, there were no murals, yet the dead end following the trap held a small shrine to some unnamed kobold deity. The trap itself was slightly more intricate, mostly due to the lack of obvious exit holes or spots where flying, slashing-bladed death would emerge. Given the nature of our surroundings, my dislike for kobolds was already pretty impressive, but locating a bunch of pressure plates and afterwards finding the exit holes at the end of the tunnel, where it'd be completely impossible to see them until they'd spewed their contents at us, caused me to start actively loathing the little bastards. Feeling quite satisfied with the lack of death by traps and my most recent skill up in spot, we started down the last corridor. Our torch caused the shadows to play erratically, and I slowly began to long for the outdoors again. Luckily, the conclusion to our adventure should be close by. We soon arrived at the approximate distance where the traps had been located in the other corridors, and this corridor was only slightly different in that part of the trap had already been set off. The third tunnel was a repeat performance of the first one, with a couple of murals, trigger points scattered all over the center of the floor, and an unknown trap. But definitely something involving the 20-something holes in the ceiling. Honestly, though, their ingenuity in attempting to cause me harm was old news, and the traps themselves also seemed pretty antiquated. What was entirely new was our situation, standing baffled and perplexed at the third dead end out of 3. The murals hadn't held any hints, being exact copies of the first corridor, and the shrine in the middle had held no text, hieroglyphs, or helpful pictograms, just a slightly lumpy statue. I scratched the back of my head. "Any ideas? You're sure that this was the tunnel that had been used most?" Daria seemed as perplexed as I was.
Almost certain. This place makes little sense to me, however. These are old traps. Why would anybody want to trap every single corridor when none of it leads anywhere?
I really don't know. Why kobolds do what they do confuses me most of the time. I mean, trapping a single corridor would likely be to protect something, right? Hurt anybody who got close to something important? But trap all three? Who the hell does that? All in order to protect a badly crafted statue and some murals. I slapped my forehead. Unless it's all part of one huge lie. They placed the murals to tell anybody who'd come investigating that they were just innocent farmers sent to fertilize the land and sow crops. But how does that make sense with what we've seen up top? Lyle got it right away. Yeah, not many farms around in the settlement. I felt like I was on a roll. So, they try to divert the attention from whatever they're really up to, and then they place traps everywhere in order to discourage people from investigating too closely, which means, I said with a triumphant laugh, that you were right the whole time, Daria, and this is the exact spot we needed to go in order to continue. Let's put an extra torch somewhere and you guys can help me search. Once we'd gotten that far, locating the triggers for the trapdoor really wasn't too hard. It did take a bit of calculated effort to open the trap doors given the triggers were shaped exactly like the pressure plates for the traps themselves. In the end, we meticulously examined the end of the corridor for any other possible murder holes, ensconced ourselves behind Lyle, who knelt behind his shield, just in case, and threw an unlit torch at the trigger. The satisfaction at seeing the end wall turn inwards with a rumbling groan was immense, and I barely managed to suppress a cry of triumph. After a moment, we managed to wipe the smiles off our faces and get back into the seriousness of it. Whatever enemies might have stayed here would likely be nearby. We moved forward in the same patient tempo we'd been using until now, searching everything painstakingly for more surprises. Nothing new, just another instance of the same type of tunnel. Daria quickly motioned us to stillness, however, and put a hand to her ear. Straining to listen, it took me a while until I noticed what she'd heard. There was a constant background sound down this tunnel. I couldn't tell exactly what it was, only that it sounded somehow familiar, a low rumbling of sorts. Halfway down the tunnel, we spotted a glow in the distance, and we decided to put out our torches in order to avoid informing everybody about our whereabouts until absolutely necessary. We then proceeded forwards at a slow crawl, alert and ready for anything or everything this damn place might throw at us. Nevertheless, the tableau that met us at the end of the tunnel did faze us all for quite a bit. The tunnel we'd been traversing had been moving almost imperceptibly downwards for a while, and now it opened up, outwards and upwards into a cavernous chamber with tiled walls covered in elaborate murals on all sides, and supported by twin rows of huge pillars traversing the entire 50 meters of length, and one gigantic mural taking up the entire back wall, behind some sort of pedestal that had likely been utilized as a speaking platform. Several tunnel exits led away from the chamber, clearly showing the enormity of what the kobolds had created here. Nonetheless, as above, so below. The decay from being left unattended for several years was also starting to show. The crude tiles had fallen from the walls in several places, and dust and dirt piled up everywhere. Regardless, the place looked like any archaeologist's wet dream, and my inner greedy pig was squealing with delight. Actually, I never really understood that phrase, inner greedy pig. Wouldn't he just be snuffling for truffles and mud? If I had some sort of spirit animal symbolizing my greed, it'd without a doubt be an inner mimic. I could see him in my mind's eye, long, prehensile tongue sticking out from between the lids of the chest, salivating with the thought of rolling all the shiny, tasty loot in between. Sometimes my mind manages to run away from me, and this situation was a prime example. Somehow, Caught up with my moronic inner monologue, I'd even managed to disregard the elephant in the room. Out of the blue, Daria grabbed my collar and dragged me down to the floor where I berated myself for not paying attention, while observing what awaited us in the center of the room. Really, it was impressive how I'd managed to stare at the scenery without focusing on this immediately. While the lit oil lanterns dispersed around the room were obviously recent additions, the large setup placed right in front of the pedestal containing a couple of tables, tomes, and other items I couldn't see from this far away were also clearly not part of the scenery. But what truly caught my attention was the blood-smeared creature lying right before the tables in the middle of a scattered bunch of remains in various stages of decay, happily chomping away at what looked like a leg bone. The sound it made was a lot like purring, but there was no way that this was a feline. It looked more like the unlikely love child from a grizzly and a skunk, a long, heavily furred body with short legs, ferocious claws, and growling that was deep enough that I felt it in my bones. The tag over the creature, Shadow-Infested Wolverine, written in a dark orange, was intimidating enough that I lowered myself even closer to the ground. If the creature was tough enough that it'd be a dangerous, possibly lethal challenge to our entire group, we definitely needed to come up with a decent game plan for the attack. Personally, I only had information on the Wolverine, which probably wasn't all that helpful in this case. Sure, bad-tempered and lethal claws seemed to be right on the money, but I was hoping that the rest of the description was way off. There was one additional detail about the tag that had me worrying, though: the shadow-infested part. Looking closely, parts of the Wolverine's fur and body were discolored in large black blemishes, which seemed to be rougher, more jagged even. We pulled back a bit into the tunnel and sat down to discuss our possibilities. Our eyes kept glancing towards the end of the tunnel. Clearly I wasn't the only one who felt anxious about facing the creature. I whispered, "Attack or pull back? Do you think we can pull this off?" Lyle grimaced and acted exactly like the stories would want him to, heroically.
"Of course we attack. This is the chance to take down whatever has been plaguing our lives for years."
After considering for a moment, Daria added,
I truly want to take it down, but in complete honesty, this creature alone would not be able to take down and remove all signs of a great number of battle-hardened caravans. There might be more down here.
I agreed. It's possible that others are around, but I really believe we ought to give it a shot. First, what are the odds of being able to catch that creature unaware again? Second, I don't know much about animals, but that one looks like a carnivore. Won't it be able to sniff out our presence? The moment they find out we've been here, they can just move camp and we'd be left back at square one. Daria scowled, but nodded her assent.
Their sense of smell is impeccable, and damn, you're right. We will have to chance it. As for wolverines in general, they are ferocious critters that can disembowel opponents easily with their claws. They are actually pretty slow over longer distances. Even Lyle would be able to outpace it, armored as he is. But at shorter intervals, they can often outpace a human being. What else? Let's see. The similarity to a skunk is not a coincidence. They have a set of scent glands or the like that can release an absolutely vile smell. But I honestly cannot remember whether they are able to use it as an attack, but just be aware. One final factor. Did any of you notice the...
She gestured around her body, looking for the right words. The dark splotches on the animal? Yeah. I nodded grimly. Unfortunately, I'm fairly confident that the animal has been enchanted somehow. It looked like the dark patches were harder and rougher than the furred spots, and, well, we really have no idea what effect it might have, so... Battle plan? Daria took the initiative.
I have an attack that, if I hit the legs, might cripple it to reduce its speed. I'm thinking I should start out with that.
I gave her the thumbs up. I like it. I'm fairly sure none of my spells can take the creature completely out of commission. It's probably too tough for that. We ought to try to take turns keeping it stunned or off balance, Lyle. That leaves Daria and me free to cause some damage while it's stunned or out of it. The half-orc woman agreed.
I have a couple of other tricks I will be trying out on that account. This might work. Only if it goes straight for you or me, Arcangelo, we need to move quickly in order to incapacitate it, and then make ourselves scarce as rapidly as possible.
We all stared at each other for a bit, and then quietly rose, moving back to the entrance. Daria pointed out our routes. I was going right, Lyle up the middle, and Daria left. I noticed that I was breathing rapidly. The gravity of the moment was getting to me, as we were going to attack the highest-level creature I'd seen so far with a partially untested group. This might go south in so many different ways. We silently moved a bit into the chamber and watched as Daria pulled back her bow to its full extension, her arrow brushing back a lock of hair, eyes narrowed and focused on the target. She looked ferocious enough that I almost used my photographic memory ability then and there. She really cut an impressive figure. Then she released the arrow. The wolverine screeched in a high-pitched tone, and our plans went straight to hell. I rapidly cut to the right, raising the violin and readying a stun blast, when I noticed that the wolverine had decided to move to my left, aiming straight for the person who'd managed to hurt it. Its left front paw was dripping with blood, and the look on its face was clearly murderous. Lyle was running to intercept, shield readied and lowered, and he was making good time, when the wolverine, still stalking through the chamber, coiled its limber body together and leapt, covering 10 meters in a single jump and taking us all by surprise. It slashed out with the undamaged paw, and only a graceful dive and roll from Daria allowed her to get away with a superficial slash to the stomach area. Even that glancing attack had taken a toll of almost 20% of her health, though, and now Lyle was placed in between me and the wolverine, who was very much ignoring Lyle, going for the softer target. Daria managed to sidestep another attack and put one of the pillars between the two, which opened the path for Lyle, who charged straight for the animal, shield bashing straight at its side. Unfortunately, it was not taken by surprise, or maybe it merely resisted the skill, because it met the shield straight on with a thunderous swipe, causing the metal to scream from the impact. Even from a distance, I could see that the shield was taking a serious battering instantly. The shadow-covered claws of the creature seemed to be hell on the hard metal. To his credit, Lyle was not fazed, because he ducked slightly, using shield kick, and caused the animal to stumble backwards, clearly disoriented. Daria took the opportunity to take 2 rapid pot shots at the animal, causing its health to drop marginally. I'd been running all the while, and finally arrived from behind the pillar where Daria was standing, just in time to watch the wolverine shake the confusion from its eyes, narrow its gaze on me, once again tighten like a spring, and leap for me. Sure, I saw it coming, but nevertheless, I just barely had time to cast a stun blast at the animal, and only managed to shift my weight slightly before the animal tumbled into my legs, throwing me into the air like a particularly unlucky bowling pin. Everything was confusion for a second before I managed to get a feeling for what was up and down, and the pain of the charge settled on me. I'd lost almost a third of my health at that attack, and there'd clearly also been some additional debuff because my leg hurt had almost buckled when I fought my way to my feet. Blessedly, both Lyle and Daria had taken good advantage of the wolverine being momentarily downed. Lyle put in a few solid whacks, one sliding from the dark blemish on the foreleg and the other clearly connecting with its snout, smashing a few of its protruding incisors. Daria spent a moment concentrating on some attack which connected with the animal's rump, penetrating deeply. The health of the animal had gone below 60% now, and I added my bit, hitting home with a sonic missile, which it was discourteous enough to ignore entirely. Whether I'd hit a shadow patch or it had just resisted the spell entirely, I couldn't tell. For the moment, it looked like Lyle had the monster well in hand, and I was preparing to angle a sonic wave enough to only hit the wolverine, when it turned its backside to Lyle and sprayed him with a toxic fluid, causing him to choke hard. If Daria hadn't forewarned us, he'd probably been entirely covered, but he managed just barely to use the shield to catch the majority of the fluid. Moments later, he was staggering back, coughing and spluttering, barely able to breathe, while the Wolverine was dogging him, unaffected by the horrible stench that was threatening to disrupt my concentration even from 15 meters away. Lyle tore at the bindings of the shield, trying to remove it from his arm, and I could clearly see that I needed to step in if I were to save him from a disemboweling. I rapidly cast Sonic Push on the animal, summoning a sound wave to push it slightly sideways. This created a bit of distance between it and Lyle, while fortuitously also causing it to miss an attack. In quick succession, I followed up with a stun blast, barely managing to edge the spell around Lyle. It worked, though, and Lyle finally succeeded in removing his shield, throwing it to the side, while Daria and I rained pain on the Wolverine as best we could. I really needed to learn more than 2 damage spells. Seeing that our only real defensive capabilities had just been removed, I yelled,
We need to finish it now! Attack, damn it!
Lyle reacted quickly and managed to deliver a full 2-handed strike to the creature's furred back, resulting in an audible crack, and landing the animal flat on its stomach just before it came to once again. It was down to 20% health, and I was yelling for the others to continue. Victory felt like it was just around the corner. The Wolverine decided to disagree with my assessment. Instead of wasting the time getting to its feet, it dug its claws into the ground and set off, causing it to slide almost 10 meters across the dust-covered ground and landing it a couple of meters in front of Daria. She impressed me, kept her cool even right in the face of the beast, and calmly delivered an arrow at point-blank range straight into its shoulder before attempting to dodge away. The Wolverine ignored the horrible damage it was taking and tore right after Daria, managing to snag her left leg. It bore her to the ground and followed up, closing its teeth on her ankle and starting to furiously work its head back and forth. Even from a good 8 meters away, I could tell the damage to Daria's leg was horrendous. She had no way of ignoring the damage or getting free by herself, and was bounced left and right like a rag doll. The Wolverine was standing right over Daria, and I could see no way to stun it without hitting Daria as well. A quick glimpse told me that Lyle was sprawling headlong on the ground. Whether from his clumsy nature or due to the disorientation from the stench attack, I couldn't tell. I could clearly see that Daria wouldn't be able to wait for Lyle's contributions, and I couldn't risk the Wolverine resisting my spells. So I activated my High Tide skill and aimed a stun blast straight at the two. Both Daria and the Wolverine were affected, and the animal sprawled, twitching right on top of Daria's legs. I followed up with a sonic push, knocking the animal off of Daria and a bit away, and immediately added insult to injury with a sonic missile and a sonic wave, and that was it. All my useful abilities were on cooldown, and the beast was slowly getting back to its feet again with Daria clear in its sight. Her health bar was barely existent, with only a few slivers remaining, and I moved to interpose myself between the animal and her, fully aware that I wouldn't make it in time. I could almost cry in frustration. We were so damn close. This is when Lyle finally arrived at the scene, his mace raised high over his head, and threw himself straight at the Wolverine with absolute disregard for his own health. He hit the badly damaged animal in the neck with a resounding crunch, but didn't pause, mace rising and falling again and again until it had finally stopped moving entirely. I looked at Lyle in amazement. Whichever parts of him weren't covered in blood were liberally sprinkled from the stench attack, and he reeked to high heaven. But at that moment, I finally got the knight in shining armor thing. It was all about timing, and my boy friggin' excelled. My attention moved on swiftly to Daria, who had raised herself on her elbow, judging the damage done to her leg before attempting to get up. She then looked at me, and our eyes met, and once again, I was thoroughly impressed by her. Daria's mien was not one of pain, fear, or relief. On the contrary, she had a fierce grin on her face, and her eyes sparkled, and she had clearly enjoyed the savage combat as well as the close call. She opened her mouth to say something to me, which was completely lost to me as she was enveloped in a torrent of dark explosions a moment later. My mind froze. I had no idea what had just happened. Daria sank to the ground, pierced by some dark power, and a second later, her body faded away, leaving only a quiver of arrows lying on the ground. It was only when a shout echoed from one of the side tunnels.
"Lion, curse you all! Hey, Bruce! What have they done to you?"
That my brain kicked back in again. I glanced at the side tunnel and spotted a robed and masked humanoid emerging from a side tunnel, running in our direction. His tag of 1 was dark orange as well, stating simply, "Masked Assailant," and I made a quick decision.
Lyle, we can't win this! Run! Now!
I had to push him to get started, but in seconds we were sprinting for the exit, and I was confirmed that I'd made the right decision by a spell hitting me in the back, tearing through my body and almost causing me to fall. That quick spell had removed an extra 35%, leaving me well below half health. I stumbled along and tore the tin ring of minor haste off my hand, passing it to Lyle.
Use this right away!
He started to speak up in disagreement, but I cut him off.
Legs busted, I won't make it! Go!
We had barely entered the tunnel when another dark wave came after us, slamming into the wall, and Lyle suddenly picked up speed in front of me. I hid just around the corner, counting to 5, and then stepped out and cast Stun Blast blindly. I got lucky, and our assailant fell to the ground, twitching, as I suddenly realized the opportunity I had before me, and used my photographic memory skill on the entire chamber that was laid out before me. I might not be able to make it out alive, but I'd possibly be able to identify the bastard later on. I managed to light a torch quickly, instantly turned on my heels, and sprinted back. Just because he was quite likely to get the better of me didn't mean I'd let him get away with it easily. I threw caution to the wind and ran as fast as I could with my damaged leg. Just in time, I remembered to keep to the side when I returned to the first trap, which gave me an idea. A stupid, horrible idea, but it was the best I could come up with at the time. When I made it to the intersection, I hid right next to the tunnel entrance, panting and gasping for air. I didn't have to wait more than 10 seconds before my pursuer could be clearly heard behind me, and I made a repeat performance. Only this time, I didn't try to stun him, but cast Sonic Wave, aiming to attract his attention more than out of any hope of actually hurting him. By the sound of his grunt, it worked, and I ducked straight into the next tunnel on my right, not the one leading to the exit, but the one with the shrine. I sprinted for the end of the tunnel while a loud laughter emanated behind me. Obviously, he'd established that I'd managed to jump into the wrong tunnel. In short succession, I reached the end, avoiding the pressure plate, and knelt down behind the tiny shrine, shielding my body to the greatest possible extent from whatever he'd choose to throw at me. I also placed my violin in my inventory. It wouldn't be helpful for what I had in mind. Obviously, my assailant had remembered to read the Evil Villain Handbook, because he slowed down his pace when he got closer to me and started a bloody monologue. Seriously, it was almost textbook perfect. My brain almost failed to process what he was saying. It was so cliched.
As you have caused pain to me and mine, I will repay you tenfold. Your feeble mind cannot hold the idea of the torments I will subject you to.
And so on. He did cut an impressive figure, though. Shadows were swirling around his body, obscuring his figure and fading in and out of existence around his hands with varying forms. Chains, bands of steel, spiked gauntlets. His visage was as scary as it was inconstant. I realized he'd stopped walking and speaking, about 20 meters away, and searched my mind for the last words he'd spoken. Ah, yes, a timeless classic.
"Do you have any last words?"
That was my cue to act, and I got in character, crawling forwards on my knees in subjugation, murmuring words along the lines of,
Please, don't kill me. We couldn't have known he was yours. I'll do anything.
And so on and so forth while I moved slowly forwards on my knees, readying an item from my inventory. When I was about 8 meters away, he finally moved to do something, and I saw my chance to act. My right hand shot forward with all my limited strength, throwing my blanket at the bastard, attempting to unfurl it and cover as much as possible. Now, the plan was for the carpet to momentarily blind him, and then I'd stun him and execute the trap, hopefully taking him out or cause enough damage to incapacitate him. Unfortunately, my throw didn't come out quite right, and the blanket hit the ground in front of him instead. In response, another wave of darkness tore through my body, leaving me half-stunned with pain and with only memories remaining of the good health I'd recently enjoyed. I tried to force a stun blast into existence, but without my musician skill and with the distraction of the pain, it fell apart in my hands. As a last resort, I hurriedly dragged my crowbar out of my inventory, tossed it at the pressure plate, and rolled over to the nearest wall, entering the fetal position. A loud series of shtick sounds ensued, and miraculously, I was left untouched. In disbelief, I thought, did it really work? And rolled to my back, glaring at the place where he was, or rather at the shadowy substance in the middle of the corridor holding more than 10 arrows captured mid-air. A split second later, the substance disappeared, and I could see my assailant once again. He did not look pleased. His arm shot out as he delivered his final comment.
I believe I promised you pain.
Say one thing for my heretofore unnamed enemy. Say he delivers on his promises. I don't know how long I was stranded in my personal purgatory, but it was long enough for me to actually look forward to the resulting pop-up. Chapter 24. A Brief Interlude. You have died. You can either wait for resurrection or respawn at your respawn point. Warning: respawning can result in negative effects to your items and stats or loss of items. Wait or respawn. Moments later, I reappeared in the town square in Grant's Crossing, panting and fatigued with the memory of the torments I'd just been forced to endure. I had no time to waste, however, and I marched straight for the town gates in search of Lyle. There was no time to stock up on potions, new gear, or whatever else I might find useful, but 2 minutes later found me walking briskly along the forest path once again. Running was not a possibility. I'd exhaust my stamina in minutes, and then I'd have to rest or walk really slowly to recuperate. And at least I had had a bit of time I could dedicate to judge just how damaging the death toll had been, as well as going through all the pop-ups I'd received during my tunnel escapades. All right. Spot had ended up increasing twice, actually, and I'd received another point to each of the spells I'd used, as well as sonic spells. Brilliant. Leadership had actually also increased twice, netting me another point to use. Lovely. Finally, finishing off the Wolverine had gained us 400 experience points. Quite impressive for a single enemy. As for the bad news, dying, as well as the pummeling I'd taken earlier, had cost me massive damage to my clothes. They were looking more and more like rags these days, and a toll of 240 experience points. Also, none of us had received any loot whatsoever from the entire affair. All in all, I didn't find it to be that horrible a cost, right until I noticed that I'd lost my apprentice's copper pendant of charisma. Having my second-best item drop in favor of that shadow-covered spawn was really pretty insulting, and something I'd pay back with severe interest, should the opportunity arise. My trek along the forest path was 100% uneventful. About halfway through, some loud cursing might have scared a couple of birds off their branches as I realized that I could just have used the opportunity when I'd stunned my assailant to sprint over and tear off his hood and figure out who the culprit was. But that's beside the point. In order to cut away the suspense, 2 hours down the path, I came upon Lyle and Daria, who were jogging back towards the village, and both were doing fairly well, even though Lyle stank to high heaven. I am not a hugging type. I've mentioned this earlier, but it bears repeating. This is why Lyle was subjected to a happy, emotional, and truly manly pat on the back instead. There was nothing much to tell for either Daria or him. He'd jogged the entire way back without running into anything or anybody, and Daria had ran all the way until she met up with Lyle. This isn't to say that we were one happy family. Lyle was obviously very unhappy with the fact that I'd overruled him and we'd let the villain get away. But I promised him that the following days I'd focus almost exclusively on finding clues about who he was and where to find him, which mollified him slightly. Daria, on the other hand, was surprisingly blasé about the whole thing. Lyle told me that once she'd learned that he was all right, she'd been all smiles and relaxed entirely. I offered to replace the quiver of arrows she'd lost, but she declined, and after a while, she actually said that she agreed with the decisions I'd made during the fight. High praise from her, if ever I'd heard any. We made it back to the village without any incidents and parted, promising to meet the next day over lunch in order to discuss how best to proceed with locating our shadow mage. I looked at the in-game clock and decided to call it a day. It was 6:30 in the evening, and boy, did I feel the need to blow off some steam. The Warlock's End was almost full, as was customary around this time, and I debated with myself whether I'd prefer to get something to eat, something to drink, or just retire to my room and play. And I was mildly surprised when the response I got was neither. It might have been in reaction to my death or the gloomy surroundings we'd been creeping around in, but I felt the need for some social interaction more than ever. So I caught Gillam's eye, gestured for something to eat and to drink, and then I climbed the small stage and got my violin out. This evening was different. Looking back, for pretty much all of the nights I'd played at the tavern, I'd had some sort of agenda with my playing. First off, I'd been trying to impress the populace with my skill set, earning more reputation and getting to know them, and then later on, I'd even used it in order to properly get the audience in a mindset for me to be able to recruit a helper from their ranks. I didn't feel bad for this. This was still a game, and hell, why would I play this class if I didn't use my gifts to my advantage? Still, this evening I just relaxed, played whatever the hell came to my mind, and simply had fun. I know I probably should have been a bit despondent or downtrodden, what with the failure and near escape of Lyle, but, well, I've always been like this. At the start of a puzzle or challenge, I might abandon it entirely if I make no headway or see no possible way to advance. But the moment I see the first progress, it's game on. And that was the exact thought I was directing to my shadowy adversary lurking out there somewhere. Game on, you shady bastard. I grinned inwardly and went back to my music and crowd. I had a few drinks over the evening, but generally I was just lost in the moment, loving every little bit of it. Sometimes I just ambled through the room, chatting with people. Sometimes I sang or played. I must have eaten at some point, but I'm not really sure. A drunken dwarven mother taught me a dwarvish nonsense song that is used when washing clothes. A powerful song with harsh tonalities and a rhythmic pounding cadence that'd definitely work well for a monotonous task such as cleaning clothes in a river or keeping your galley slaves rowing at the same beat. Anyway, the song was also great as a drinking song, and while only a fifth of the room looked like they knew what they were singing, they seemed to enjoy it. I also introduced them to the piece by that girl who got famous playing the violin in the snow, doing splits and looking absolutely fabulous at the same time. I always forget her name. Now I was only able to replicate 1 out of 4 of those feats, playing the piece, that is. But no one seemed to mind, seeing as how it's a wonderful number, thrilling, life-affirming, and buoyant all in one. At some point, I also spotted the blushing young girl, half-dwarf, half-human, and all teenaged nervousness, who'd taught me the chant of the Royal Cabal and the separation some days earlier, and roped her into singing The Wild Rose with me. At some point, I'd been singing The Fairy Feller's Master Stroke by Queen. What can I say? I'm a sucker for their stuff, especially their less famous numbers. I was busy considering exactly what to play next when I was forcibly pushed off stage. Not entirely gently either. I looked up to complain and saw Navis flashing her happy-go-lucky grin at me. She blew me a kiss.
How about I show you how to really sing? You're not bad, but...
She left the sentence unfinished and winked at me. I knew when to back down and did so as gracefully as possible, leaving her the stage. This was the first time I'd seen her around the tavern, and I looked forward to hearing her skills. I could tell from the murmur going through the crowd that this was not an everyday experience. I found a chair and relaxed, expecting a hauntingly beautiful tune, something ephemeral, indefinable, and clearly out of this world. What we got was both less and more. She chose a simple and funny local song, The Tanner and His 7 Sons, a children's song with easily remembered and basic rhythms and a pretty damn uncomplicated moral. Thou shalt not judge thy neighbor based on his looks, or in this case, his stench. And when she sang, I lack the words to describe it succinctly, but she somehow made the song more. The power of her voice added depth, emphasis, and feeling to the song that I'd never imagined possible. More than a few wept along with the tanner when the woman of his dreams rejected him, smiled in delight when the nobleman's daughter ignored the horrible vapors resulting from his work and saw the man. Regardless of the scorn his neighbors showed him, and laughed with ever more graphic descriptions of the antics of their 7 children. Navis's vocal range wasn't even that impressive. She was a contralto, singing quite a bit lower than the majority of women, but by God, her control. I made a silent promise to myself to rein in my singing until I'd improved, and just stomped my feet, clapping along with the rest. The applause was thunderous enough that I didn't even notice her disappearing from the stage afterwards. The rest of the evening flew by. A teenaged half-orc and elven duo almost came to blows, but the situation was quickly and harshly resolved by Kif. And even more memorable, Gillum took the stage, along with a guitar, and announced how he'd show us all what music was supposed to sound like. About 45 seconds into the Madame's boudoir, he was booed off stage among loud complaints and peals of laughter. While his fingerwork wasn't really bad, his voice was something else entirely. He was apparently able to hit any tone but the one needed for the song, and it was hilarious. When at last I retired to my room, my mind was awash with the impressions from the evening, and I felt stuffed to the brim with happy feelings. My eyelids were getting increasingly heavy, but when I saw a clearly defined shadow right outside my window, I knew exactly what was asked for. I opened the window wide, laughed, and bid the forest night as well as my favorite chameleon a fond goodbye to the tunes of Brahms' Wiegenlied. Chapter 25. Stuff to learn, people to see. The following day, I woke up full of energy and excitement, which, for me, generally translates into stumbling down the stairs, grumbling softly into my breakfast, hard-boiled eggs, black bread, and fat slices of bacon, while my mind slowly started getting into gear. 20 minutes to really wake up. For me, that's about as good as it gets. Now, I was very aware of the fact that there were a number of things I needed to handle during the day. Plotting with Daria and Lyle, and turning in the first part of the quest to Mallard Bullhop, for instance. But my mind wouldn't allow me to focus on any of it before I'd satiated my curiosity, and checked out the pop-ups from the day before, which netted me a new level in musician and 2 in singing. With that, I nodded to myself, slid away my empty plate, and started looking into how my photographic memory skill actually worked. A moment of fiddling brought me to a new item pulsing in my inventory, a memory image, with a timer showing the amount of time the image would still be available. Accessing the image worked like a charm. Yesterday's scene from the underground chamber filled my vision, allowing me to peruse all the creepy details at my leisure, including the blatantly obvious figure of my shadowed adversary lying prone on the floor on the leftmost side. I tinkered about with the image a bit and located a slider that allowed me to zoom in and out, creating an extraordinary wealth of details. To my regret, that didn't help me identify the robed figure at all. Even stunned, shadows swirled over him, obscuring most of his body. His clothes were nondescript and entirely unhelpful. Grayish, dirty, voluminous robes that obscured the entire body, as well as a large hood that took damn good care of the rest. No help to be had here. I moved on to the rest of the room and was quickly taken in by how lifelike the image was, and how dilapidated the entire room seemed. The craftsmanship must have really been shoddy for the place to start falling apart by itself in a decade or two underground, or so it seemed to me, being virtually ignorant on the topic of construction work. For all I knew, this might be completely normal. The only part to mostly evade time's tooth was the huge mural in the back, and I was well pleased to see that the angle allowed me to finally peruse the contents in detail. The center of the mural showed off the head lizard honcho favorably. Strong, masculine, crowned and bearing a scepter of sorts in one hand, and a skull in another, well, actually, I wasn't entirely sure what he was up to. The mural showed a multitude of jagged lines originating from him to different groupings that all seemed to be marching away from their leader, weapons in hand. Additionally, the leader of each grouping held some sort of crystal or chalice high before them. The background of the mural seemed to depict some sort of geographical area, a country or continent maybe, with mountains, rivers, and all. But it was nothing I even remotely recognized. Seriously, would it have been too much to include a simple title? When I removed my gaze from the mural, an unexpected pop-up appeared. You have been offered a quest. Once were Legion, Chronicler Quest. You have discovered hints and pieces of the martial past of the kobold race on Ion. Decipher the meaning behind the mural and chronicle the story of what was and might have been. Reward? Unknown. Accept or decline. Well, that sure was intriguing. I knew all along that those kobolds were bad news. I pressed accept and got back to the matter at hand, figuring out more about the Shadow Mage. The first discovery was blatantly obvious. Right in front of the large table setup, parts of the floor were inscribed in a dark substance with eldritch symbols and several concentric circles. While this would be enough for me to point and yell, "Summoner," the swirling shadows surrounding the symbols clearly showed that this is what had spawned or maybe altered the Wolverine. The table itself portrayed a somewhat eccentric display. The part on the right that I had spotted earlier was a clear cut and paste from every arcane display ever. Large, dripping candles, a few pieces of occult paraphernalia, and a 20-pound tome. All items placed dead straight in their respective spot, not a hair out of place. The other part of the table, however, told a different story. A story of chaos and self-indulgence. The left-hand side was positively covered with empty bottles, cards, dice, and an impressive load of dirty dishes. 2 impromptu chairs had also been fashioned from debris dragged over to the table and piled up. The entire scene was slightly schizophrenic to look at. One side was a scene of control and self-control, while the other was a scene of debauchery and abandonment. Now, this could either mean that our summoning compadre was very meticulous when he worked and something of a slob when he relaxed with his fellow conspirators, or, more likely, that he had 2 companions. Sloppy companions who mostly dealt with drinking, eating, and gambling. I finished off with the disturbing part, the pile of humanoid remains on the chamber floor. I could clearly tell that they'd been looted. There were tons of clothes still left on the bodies, and like the bodies themselves, they were in various states of decay. You could tell that pieces of armor, rings, earrings, and similar had been removed, and on some occasions pried from the bodies. Apparently my adversaries were not averse to a little corpse digging if it could help their own finances. This led to an idea. If some of the persons who'd been harassing the caravans had been looting the corpses, where would they go to sell them? Might they actually be daft enough to go to Mrs. Bertinga's place? It was worth checking out. I spent some extra time checking out the image without finding anything else useful, but I did notice that there couldn't be more than 20 to 25 corpses in the pile at most, a far cry from the 30-plus full caravans that had gone missing over the years. This was likely of some import as well, but I failed to connect the dots. Ah well, I was nowhere near done investigating, and I'd gotten off to a decent start at least. I minimized the image and got up and went straight to the Traveler's Delight to see Mrs. Bertinga. There was no time like the present. I entered the merchant house accompanied by the melodious tinkle of a tiny doorbell. Trying to absorb the cluttered chaos of the surrounding shelves almost left me short of breath, but this time I had a clear idea of what I wanted. A new, sturdy set of clothes, learning a bit more about magic items in general, and figuring out once and for all whether being a tinkerer could somehow help me in the fight against the summoner that was starting to look more and more certain. Also, I needed a clear answer as to whether she knew if anyone had been selling used merchandise in her shop. The first two items were easily handled, and after an amiable round of barter, we'd agreed to the low price, her words, not mine, of 12 silver for an hour of education on magic lore and an impressive set of clothes. I really hadn't planned to spend as much on clothes, but when she paraded the set before me, words like majestic, impressive, and I need this kept intruding on my mind. The pants were simple, smooth, flowing, and gray with no decorations. The accompanying shirt was gray as well, but covered with flowing scrollwork in gold, crisscrossing belts, as well as some incredibly impressive matching bracelets. The material was, hell if I knew, but it was soft and looked hard-wearing, and also a cape. It had a luxurious cape that was bordered by elaborate scrollwork, which was to be clasped onto the shirt. All in all, I could easily imagine a Roman nobleman traveling around in his chariot in this outfit, and the matching black leather boots with silver scrollwork that had the softest fur imaginable on the inside. Simply looking at the clothes made me feel twice as impressive, and I was itching to change my worn outfit as soon as possible. The description read, Lesser Nobleman's Outfit. This outfit was the height of fashion in the country nobles' circles a couple of years back. The cut is elegant, and the clothes well-maintained and unused. The outfit allows the wearer to leave a good impression without completely disregarding durability. Nobleman's cape, durability 20 out of 20 plus 1 endurance. Nobleman's shirt, durability 30 out of 30 plus 1 charisma. Nobleman's pants, durability 30 out of 30. Nobleman's boots, durability 40 out of 40. Set item bonus, plus 1 charisma, 4 items equipped. Workmanship, high. Mrs. Bertinga was kind enough to allow me to change before we continued, and with that taken care of, we spent a comfortable hour furthering my education on all things magical. She was kind enough to focus foremost on the most common items, which would theoretically be of the largest advantage, allowing me to properly identify many common magic items. Suitably educated, we moved on to more serious business.
So, you want to know more about becoming a tinkerer, or as my old teacher used to say it, meddle with forces that can take your hand clean off? I'd be more than pleased to give you a rundown of the basics involved. But first, I need to ask you a personal question. Word in town is that you're a reborn. Is this true?
She looked at me, grandmotherly gaze replaced by a piercing stare, and I couldn't help but think that she had a grudge against Reborn. Maybe I ought to tell a small lie, but to hell with it, I decided and answered as politely as possible. Yes, ma'am, it's true. Does that make a difference? She giggled. I was never going to understand how different the Lizzie Bertinga was compared to her regular grandmotherly facade, and said,
Oh, yes, my dear. It makes a huge difference. You are so lucky. It means that when you make a horrible mistake and are taken apart, you'll actually get a second chance. My boy, Someday I'll have to show you my tinkering room and the protective measures I have in place for when I start experimenting with unknown reagents.
She launched straight into a long explanation and didn't allow me a chance to ask exactly what she meant by being taken apart, or maybe she was just having fun at my expense. Mean old grandma.
The most important part of tinkering, if you want to use it for anything halfway decent, is to actually tinker. A lot of people start out with the profession and then never actually experiment, but settle for buying recipes and trading them with other tinkerers. We have a word for those, dear. Amateurs. While they might come so far as to have a decent selection of known recipes, they'll never understand the why of our profession. Why does seaman's tears combined with fluorescent seaweed boost your natural agility? They wouldn't be able to tell you, but I could.
Her gleaming eyes somehow managed to add the words, "at a price."
Oh, but I am getting ahead of myself, Arcangelo. I do apologize. That will not be a problem for you for some time still. We should focus on the basics for a bit, and then I'll let you decide whether a tinkerer's path is for you.
Mrs. Bertinga put both her hands behind her back as if reciting a lesson learned by rote long ago.
The most important thing to focus on as a tinkerer is the core. The core defines what you can make, how powerful its effect will be, and how you can improve upon it afterwards. What is the core, you ask? Good question, young man. A practical demonstration is probably in order. Now, a reborn, such as yourself, probably sticks his shapely nose into lots of dangerous situations and, as a result, ends up with tons of natural resources, from bear paws to snake eggs. Right?
She raised one eyebrow at me. I nodded while trying to push down the overwhelming feeling of being back in school again, being examined at the blackboard.
Great! Now, cough it up, dearest. Whatever you found during your latest shenanigans, just line them up here on the counter.
I did as she asked, presenting one of each of the different rat parts Lyle and I had found during our battle in the cavern. Mrs. Bertinga hemmed and hawed over the items before she arrived at the dire rat tail and the fury gland, where she started laughing.
Ooh, woo, Arcangelo, what have you been up to? Now, these two we're saving for a later discussion. The other parts, however, are perfect for our little explanation. Do you mind if this one is consumed?
She said, pointing at a weak rat tail. I murmured something to the negative, and she instantly focused on the tail, cupping both hands around it. A moment later, a soft glow started to emanate from her hands. The tail started glowing, and a moment later, it dissolved, amalgamating into a tiny glowing globe that looked like it was made from glass. I asked, "Can I look?" And she nodded. I brought my eye right up next to the globe and thought I could see a tiny dark mote swirling around inside. There was no descriptive text or anything explaining what she'd just made, so I simply asked, "What's this, Mrs. Bertinga?"
This, Arcangelo, is a tinkerer's core. If you were a tinkerer, you'd be able to sense the contents and strength of the core. But for the rest of the world, it's just a pretty doodad. The size and looks depend on the item that you deconstructed for the use of your core. And this one resulted in a weak agility debuff. This is where the fun part comes into play. Tinkerers can learn how to create any silly number of variations of different items. But the basics are simple. We can create traps, grenades, and automatons.
I believe she must have spotted how she caught my attention at that because she laughed softly and continued.
Oh, don't worry, dear. I will elaborate further. Now, where was I? Ah, yes. Traps, grenades, and automatons. The value of the core itself is simple. Whatever feature the core holds will also apply to whatever you decide to create. In this case, creating an automaton would be a foolish act, since it would inherit the agility debuff. And we don't want to waste resources to create something that is below average, do we? The grenade or the trap, however, might be useful in the right situation. Please do bear in mind that we are dealing with a core created by the most common, and hence weakest, type of items.
She put an admonishing finger in the air.
To begin with, I encourage you to only use common or uncommon items for cores. Later on, you would hate yourself for having wasted rare items on failed experiments. Luckily, you will not be able to create too much havoc right away, since you can only create cores from one item in the start. Later, you'll learn how to combine 2 or 3 items to make better cores with additional effects. We should probably have another chat at that time again, if you make it that far.
She tittered again.
But I digress yet again. Funny how that happens more often when I have a handsome young man eager for my words.
I must not have been able to hide the look of dismay on my face because she continued, clearly too amused to cover it.
Oh, you are a funny plaything. If only I were 40 years younger. But please stop distracting me, dear. Whichever type you choose to construct will be very limited to begin with. Simple snares for traps, clay containers for grenades, and the most horrid stick and twine automatons. But as you learn, your possibilities will improve, as will your skills. Which leads us straight to the most important question today. Do you, Archangelo, wish to become a tinkerer?
You have been offered a primary profession. Tinkerer. Tinkerers are the masters of making the most of very little. Through constant experimentation and acquisition of knowledge, they learn how to make wondrous and deadly grenades, traps, and automatons. This profession choice is not for the faint of heart, as tinkerers often fall prey to their own art, and the usual death penalties apply. Warning: your choice of primary profession is permanent. Accept or decline. Of course I accepted. Like there was ever any doubt at this point. This was exactly the sort of edge I'd been looking for. Being able to learn, create, and apply different solutions to varying situations might have me pull through where simple force couldn't. Sure, there was the part about mayhem and danger during the experimentation, but that was what the respawn was for, right? Mrs. Bertinga was even kind enough to hand me 10 sets of items for level 1 traps, grenades, and automatons each, as she said.
The first taste is always free. And did I happen to mention that I hold the base items for almost everything you'll be able to learn for the first long while?
With the possibilities swirling around in my mind, I could barely concentrate on my remaining task with the need to dive into the intricacies of the tinkering art. It took a major effort on my part to pull my mind back to the task at hand and ask Mrs. Bertinga, I am already deeply indebted to you for the teachings you've bestowed upon me until now. But if you don't mind, I have one additional question that might be somewhat delicate in manner. She tittered and said,
Well, color me intrigued, my boy. Don't beat around the bush. You never know when a woman my age might make her last trade.
I cleared my throat. All right. This might intrude on, never mind, I'm stalling. Basically, we've discovered that there is a group that has been waylaying caravans nearby over the past years, and I have reason to believe that they might have tried to sell some of the items they've removed from their victims. Have you had regular dealings with somebody who might fit that description? She grew completely still for a moment.
Are you sure you even realize what you're asking, Archangelo?
Her mien grew steadily darker, and without waiting for an answer, she continued.
Of course you do. Those gods-cursed, moronic, filthy little murderers! Choke my trade, will you?
Mrs. Bertinga paced back and forth for a while until she clearly pulled herself together and turned back towards me, teeth bared in a snarl.
Yes, I know who it was. Herbert and Berthold. They've sold me items from time to time. The stories differed. Gambling with caravan guards, stumbling upon somebody who'd been attacked by monsters, and once even coming across a caravan that had been decimated. Of course, if I'd known they'd been targeting my damn village all the while.
She turned away again, fuming. I spent a while talking her down and impressing upon her how important it was that she didn't act on her own initiative if we were to find the real mastermind behind the attacks. Shortly thereafter, I left the merchant house, completely flustered with thoughts, speculations, and possibilities. I considered planning what to do about them, but my mind really couldn't handle the information I'd just gained. Herbert had been so damn helpful, and Berthold had even offered to join my party. Why would he have done that? In order to stop my mind from reeling, I decided then and there that I'd postpone laying any plans until I'd met with Lyle and Daria a couple of hours later, and instead distract my mind from all the intricacies of the situation by delving into the possibilities of my newfound ability. Crossing the town square, I did allow myself to enjoy the sight of a bunch of pop-ups I'd received. Barter and diplomacy increased, as did magic lore, twice, and this. Congratulations, you have learned a new skill. Tinker. Tinkering is the dangerous practice of learning how to combine different items and ingredients, often dangerous or magical in nature, into different types of traps, bombs, or automatons. Every point to tinker will increase the strength of the core you create by 2% and decrease the chance that the crafting fails. Stat: Intelligence. A short while later, I had arranged all available ingredients and materials in front of me in neat piles on the table back in my own tavern room and cracked my knuckles. It was time to get tinkering. I accessed my character sheet, where a new button had appeared next to my crafting class and level, simply stating, Tinker. I pressed it, and instantly I was propelled into what I could only imagine was the crafting mode, where I immediately lost myself. An hour or so later, when I closed the crafting menu, well, most people know that state you can enter from time to time where you're so thoroughly immersed in whatever you're doing that you fail to stop and check whether what you're doing is borderline retarded or not. The result, when you come to your senses, can be anything from, wow, that works like a charm. I'm not entirely sure how I did it, but yay, to, yeah, so I just spent the last 4 hours customizing the looks of my character. To, did I just gamble away all my savings? Mine was more like, wow, what a rush. And now I'm out of materials. Damn. The list of what I didn't do is pretty exhaustive. I didn't rummage through every available menu, didn't study my findings meticulously, and I definitely didn't give any thought to exactly what would be the most efficient for me to craft. I'm not even sure that I figured out what all buttons and open fields meant. I did have fun, though. I experimented away, absorbed by the possibilities and intricacies of the system, and was intent on raising my tinkering skill as high as possible. The skill did climb all the way to 4, so it wasn't all bad, but I sure did waste a lot of materials on failed attempts, probably due to my low intelligence stat, and I felt pretty convinced afterwards that I could have ended up with a better result. In the end, I promised myself that for the next round of tinkering, I'd spend more time considering the possibilities and costs in order to obtain the optimal result. However, when I was observing the nice stack of different creations stacked on the table in front of me, I couldn't help but smile. Damn, but the Tinkerer class showed promise. Sure, I wasn't entirely sure whether all this stuff would prove any worth in the upcoming battle, but it was a start. I was left with Small Twine Puppet. This most basic of automatons, made out of sticks and twine, is close to falling apart, but might serve for a distraction or two. Damage 10 to 20, hit points 10, activation cost 30 mana, activation time 30 seconds, duration 3 minutes. I had made 5 of these from the Lynx claws, and they actually looked kinda scary, like a badly made children's puppet with longish claws attached. Something straight from a bad slasher movie. I also had a single version with double the HP, which still sucked, and 20 to 40 damage from the large Lynx. Small Rope Trap. This trap is basically an ensorcelled length of string. It will need to be attached somewhere in order to activate it, and will then unleash its enchantment on whoever or whatever stumbles unwarily into the trap. Effect: -1 agility. Effect duration, 10 minutes. Activation cost, 30 mana. Activation time, 30 seconds. Trap duration, 24 hours. So, yeah, I'd gone completely overboard with these, crafting 12 of them from the rat tails, especially since it was a glorified piece of string. In my defense, I actually had an idea for how these could be used, but the jury was out on their usefulness until I'd heard Daria's opinion. Small clay bomb. A fragile clay shell surrounds the Tinkerer's core and will release the enchantment contained within upon impact with the target. Damage upon impact, 3 to 5. Effect, 3 to 5 bleeding damage every 10 seconds for 60 seconds. Now, these I liked. I'd created 5 of them, also made from the lynx claws. While the damage was negligible, if you managed to throw 3 or 4 at a target and ran away, the damage over time would be quite decent. I also had 2 larger versions that dealt 5 to 10 bleeding damage instead, and even had a 1 meter radius effect so you could, theoretically, hit multiple enemies with 1 bomb. Small clay bomb. A fragile clay shell surrounds the Tinkerer's core and will release the enchantment contained within upon impact with the target. Damage upon impact, 3 to 5. Effect, -20% movement speed. Effect duration, 3 minutes. These last 3 were lifesavers, crafted from dire rat fur. I'd be able to throw one of these lovelies in the face of a charging enemy and retreat until I could safely cast spells or shoot from afar again. Brilliant. All in all, it amounted to a decent pile of low-level stuff, which in itself might verge on bad, but combined with a good team and my spells, it might even the odds of a difficult battle. My mind had been well and truly distracted for quite a while, and suddenly I was raving to get on with the challenge of how to best take down the dwarven duo and their unknown companion. I still had almost an hour to kill before I had to meet up with Daria and Lyle, and decided to go chat with Chertog to learn more about the shadowy summoner. Chapter 26. Chatting with Friends. Chertog was out and about in the cemetery weeding the grounds, and a huge smile appeared on his face when he spotted me. He waved me over.
If it isn't my lost apprentice. Finally realized that you needed to do something about that horrible sense of humor of yours and come begging to the master for education? Or did you finally figure out what's happened to those damned stubborn skeletons of mine?
I cleared my throat noisily. Someday I was really going to get around to looking into that quest. Unfortunately, no. Apparently I've upgraded from undead to demons, and I really need your wisdom. I shamelessly flattered his ego while I told him what had happened. I didn't mention anything about the Blood Brothers, but paid special heed to everything concerning the summoner. Chertog harumphed and nodded in all the appropriate places, and when I was finally done, he summed it up quite nicely.
You're basically looking for any information that might prepare you for an eventual face-off with the bastard that put you down? All right, I can do that.
He motioned for me to follow him and walked to his shed. On the way there, he turned towards me and said,
Now, the most efficient way to get rid of a demon is surprisingly easy.
As soon as he saw my eyebrows go up in anticipation, he continued in his deadpan voice.
Yeah, you need to exorcise a lot.
I blinked at him twice until it sank in. Chertog, that was... even for you, that was horrible. He guffawed and opened his door, walking straight towards a large pile of loose sheets of parchment on a shelf held down by a huge tome. He lovingly placed the tome to the side and started leafing through the sheets.
I'm fairly certain that it should be in here somewhere. Until then, I'll have to disappoint you and say that I really don't know that much about the topic. What I do know, Archangelo, is that you're not looking for a summoner. Someone who summons raw magic energy and forces it into whichever shapes and tasks he or she wants fulfilled. No, you're looking for a demonologist, a person who makes deals with creatures and spirits from other planes of existence. Someone who trades in blood, meat and suffering in order to further his own interests.
His usually so affable tone of voice had grown quite heated in the end of his exposition, and I had to ask, Chertog, have you ever had any dealings with a demonologist? He sighed deeply and looked at me despondently before starting to speak.
Once, when I was young and trusting, well, have you ever heard about a demonic cobbler?
I shook my head in confusion. How did that even work? He looked at me earnestly and continued.
They do exist, and you'd better watch out, or they'll steal your souls.
He said, promptly falling apart into a helpless laughter. I was crestfallen. Gods! Why would you even take it that far? Chertog wiped away a tear from the corner of his eye.
You're way too easy a mark, son. Never mind all that. I found what I was looking for. Here,
he said, handing me a piece of parchment.
This is the only documentation I've got on dwarven demonologists. There really aren't that many, at least in dwarven society. I reckon all you pointy ears are weird enough you might have a larger portion, but never mind. I got it from a town crier who was informing everybody in the town. It's in common, though, so's you lesser species can also understand the threat.
I perused the parchment. It clearly wasn't too old. The vellum was still spry and uncracked, and the letters stood out in a clear, bold hand, easily conveying its meaning. Hear ye, to all law-abiding, God-fearing citizens of Tormundstad! Be warned and aware that the good Defender Guard has discovered a malicious threat in our midst. Clear signs of a demonologist have been spotted on the fringes of the town. Fret not, good people. We shall provide you with the information needed to recognize and help eliminate the threat. How to recognize a demonologist? These abominations look like you and me. However, there are clear signs of their doings that can reveal the workings of a demonologist. Symbols. Demonologists meddle with the arcane by means of eldritch symbols. If you recognize a smattering of painted or worked symbols in circles or other compositions, it might be the remains of a summoning. Loaders or nighthawks. Summoning demons is a time-consuming business. Therefore, practitioners of this vile art need hours and hours of uninterrupted time and usually exhibit either antisocial behavior or uncommon nightly routines. Disappearings! The sacrifices needed for the despicable rituals are usually sanguine in nature. Have you not seen the neighborhood dogs lately? Have the casteless inexplicably started vanishing from the streets? This might be the workings of a demonologist. Shadows and blood. The typical demonologist deals with the power of either shadows or blood, and sometimes this is reflected in his summons or himself. Unnatural behavior of the shadows, unexplainable open wounds or weeping sores can be side effects to their workings and can reveal his true nature. What should I do in case I recognize any of the above signs? Please take your findings to the Defender Guard station in the lower arches, where we will investigate it thoroughly. Any findings leading to the capture of our enemy will be rewarded. What should I do if I meet the demonologist or his summoned creature? Flee! Do not fight! A demonologist is not an enemy to be taken lightly. This is the reason why we, the Defender Guard, exist. To fight and protect you. Faith and strength supreme. Corbin Friedwulfsson. I thanked Chertog and handed the parchment back to him. Not much real information to be had, is there? And the announcement. it surely must have caused some panic in the town? He responded with a grunt.
True. The Defender Guard has a pretty pragmatic approach to this sort of thing. To them, a slight panic and a number of beatings bestowed upon loners or weirdos is an agreeable price if they can flush out the real culprit.
His jaw clenched, and it looked like he had a foul taste in his mouth when he spoke again.
To be fair, Archangelo, there's one matter that the parchment fails to describe. You don't have to resort to sacrificing people, animals, or the like in your dealings as a demonologist. It's just the path that most of the bastards choose. I've heard a few stories that I believe about demonologists who instead offer up their own powers, strength, or blood in exchange for service from a demon, or whatever assistance they want. Sometimes they're even able to trick the demons into rewarding them without having to pay. That sort of thing is pretty damn uncommon, though. Mostly, it's just good old tie you to an altar and cut your veins open types of demonologists.
I thanked him for his help and left quickly, hoping to avoid any further puns. Of course, I wasn't fast enough. As the door slammed open, he yelled,
Oi! I forgot! What do you call a demon who slurps his food?
I put my hands over my ears and continued to walk.
A goblin!
Safely back in the tavern a few moments later, I tried to remove all remnants of Chertog's horrible sense of humor with a break and a taste of Gillam's darkest ale. A lovely bittersweet creation that was thick enough for a spoon to stand up right in the glass. After checking the time, I asked Jeb to arrange for the best meals he'd be able to provide for 3 persons and to have it brought to my room. Cost me 2 silver pieces, but if ever we needed a good meal to keep our wits about us, it was now. I then retired to my room and spent a moment making it look semi-passable, and a short while later, Lyle and Daria both arrived. Our impromptu war council was in session. Their arrival coincided with the dinner, and I invited them to partake before we got down to business. Arrangements were a bit cramped. I'd dragged 2 extra chairs into the room, and with all the dishes Jeb carried in, we were sitting quite closely. We spent the first half hour just chatting and enjoying ourselves, and Lyle told me how he'd informed his father of what happened yesterday. He was livid, I can tell you that much, Archangelo.
Put my lad at risk, will you? See how ye like the taste of my hammer?
He went on for quite some time before I managed to calm him down some and tell him exactly what you'd done to help me get away. After that, he relaxed a bit, but whew, I can tell when he's still kind of angry, and you're definitely not in his good books yet. With that, a pop-up intruded on the scene. Quest updated. Good luck, Sonny. Lawrence Brennathan has grudgingly accepted that you are doing your best to protect Lyle, even at the cost of your own death and rebirth. He still remains to be fully convinced that letting Lyle join you was a good idea. Reward unknown. Penalty for Lyle's death? Minus 3,000 reputation with Lawrence Brennathan. I wasn't sure how much more I'd be able to deliver to actually convince him. Would I need to have Lyle slay a dragon right in front of him or something? When we were all quite sated, Lyle tossed himself onto my bed, while Daria and I sat on each our side of the table, and the planning began. 15 minutes later, we were done. It was quite underwhelming, really, especially considering that half that time was spent recounting the discoveries and discussions of the day. We did have to forcibly keep Lyle from running off and kicking the Dwarven brother's door in right then and there. I never knew that he had a temper beneath his timid, blushing exterior. The moment we'd talked him out of any premature action, however, all plotting went straight out the window, as they both were in complete agreement on how to proceed. "The council?" I asked. Lyle nodded eagerly. "Yeah, the council. You know, all right, you might not know it." I rolled my eyes at him, but hey, he wasn't wrong. He continued. "Thing is, the mayor takes care of all the day-to-day decisions here, but whenever something especially important comes up, the original 4 gather to agree on a decision. Or the original 3 in Gillam, I guess, since he took over from his mother, you know." I shrugged. This means my very favorite mayor, the harbor master, Mallard Bullhop, and Gillum. I suppose this qualifies as pretty darn important. And you're certain we shouldn't just go ahead and fix it ourselves?
Yes!
They answered in unison, and I held up my hands in mock surrender. And the very first war council was concluded with no real decisions made whatsoever. We agreed that I'd come get them the moment we could realistically do something ourselves again, and off I went to meet up with Mallard Bullhop, turn in the quest, and get the show on the road. I don't know exactly what I was expecting from Mallard, but he continued being the epitome of kindness and, truthfully, likely the most normal person in Grant's Crossing I'd had the pleasure of getting to know. He listened to my retelling, nodded in all the right places, and thanked me profusely for all the help I'd offered so far. He took his time pondering the implications afterwards, stroking his belly and ample sideburns, before concluding, "Hurrah is not one for threats. The power of life and death suffice for him. A humble priest like me is allowed his small eccentricities, however. So believe me when I say that we will make that dastardly shadowed despoiler pay. I will call for an emergency session of the council. Can I call upon you within the hour?" Of course, I agreed. Sure, from personal experience, once the capital A authorities got involved, everything was about to grind to a complete halt. But still, if Gillum and Mallard were involved, odds were the ball would be able to keep rolling, and we could confront the damned dwarves soon. Chapter 27. Chatting with Friends. Half an hour flew by in the tavern. I'd given Gillum the Cliff's Notes version, and we passed the time playing dice until Mallard stuck his head in the tavern door and caught our attention. We strode over to the mayor's house, where Gillum ushered me into the foyer, up the stairs, and into a room I hadn't seen before. From the raised voices inside, part of the council was already in session. The Council of Grant's Crossing looked very much the way I'd always pictured a gentleman's club. The members of the council were seated in a large room, where the white walls were decorated with stucco and covered with heavy wall hangings and elaborate paintings. The center of the room was dominated by a large circular table, carved and gilded. Everything in the room had clearly been created with an eye for quality. Opulent and gaudy in places, sure, but the workmanship of the furnishings was undeniable. Gillum took his place, and I was allowed to gawk at the assembled council members as they were placed in their Sunday finest. 3 of the 4 I already knew, but the 4th and final member I had not yet met in person. Harbor Master Grant Callahan was reclined comfortably in his heavy chair, pipe in hand and puffing contentedly. I tried not to stare. Half-orcs I'd met in plenty, but Mr. Callahan was by far the fanciest, best-dressed half-orc I'd ever met. I would have figured that a half-orc in a suit and vest attire with rimmed glasses would look absolutely ridiculous, but he managed to pull it off. The heavy gold chain around his neck showed something with waves, probably denoting his status as harbor master. Mallard took charge and told them briefly about the reasons why he'd called the emergency meeting, summarizing the information about the demonologist and his cadre, and how they had been strangling off local trade for the past few years. He handled it quite nicely, I thought, being succinct to the point and economical with his gestures. He then waved in my direction and introduced me with the words, "As Arcangelo is the one who discovered the demonologist's lair, I would ask you to pose any questions straight to him." I felt like a lamb thrown to the wolves as 3 sets of eyes focused their stares on me, and the next hour proved to be among the worst exams I've had to sit through. Their questions ranged from economical in nature from Mr. Callahan.
How much money would you estimate that they have been getting from selling their items?
To insulting and personal from the good old Latoria.
Have you got any way to prove that your claim is true?
To thoughtful ones from Gillum.
If you estimate that only part of the caravan members have been sacrificed, what has happened to the rest? Were they taken north along the path you mentioned?
A vast majority of the questions I was simply unable to answer, but with help from the memory image, I was able to describe the summoning circle in detail. Even Atoria caved and admitted that it fit with what she knew about demon summoning. In the end, with lots of unnecessary discussion, their curiosity was sated, and I was sent outside the door like a naughty child while the grown-ups deliberated. After 15 minutes or more, I was allowed back in. I'd started doubting that I'd even be allowed to know which agreement they reached, but it looked like I'd made the cut. Mr. Callahan nodded to me and sat forward in his chair. The moment showcased that his exquisite suit was also hiding a nice paunch underneath. Looked like harbor master wasn't the toughest of jobs. It turned out he spoke just as nicely as he dressed.
We thank you for your help, Archangelo. You and the other Reborn might have laid the groundwork for saving our village, for which we have fought and bled through decades, from a slow death. We will arrange for a proper reward in good time, and we should like you to come back in a week's time when it is done. For now, however, please accept our gratitude. And hear me out, because the village would ask for your help once again.
He took a short break to drink from a glass on the table, and I quickly noted the pop-up I'd received. Your reputation with Grant's Crossing has increased by 750. New reputation, 2,450. Liked. Your universal reputation has increased by 250. New reputation, 250 out of 1,000 towards next level. Awesome! I'd finally received universal reputation points. They were basically what allowed you to become known and respected, or vilified, throughout the entire continent. My path towards in-game rock stardom had finally started. I forcefully dragged my attention from my daydreaming back to Grant Callahan.
As you and your friends have provided an exemplary service to the cause of the village thus far, we would ask for your assistance once again by helping us interrogate the Garterson brothers and dig up the true identity of the demonologist.
You have been offered a quest, convincing the conniving. The Council of Grant's Crossing has asked you to somehow convince Herbert Garterson and his brother to reveal the identity behind the unnamed demonologist and arrange for his capture. The Council will grant you limited aid. Use it as you will. Reward, 300 experience points, 500 reputation with Grant's Crossing, 5 silver. Penalty for failure, minus 1,000 reputation with Grant's Crossing. Accept or decline. I accepted with a smile, and the harbor master continued with a frown on his face.
Now, as for the brothers themselves, really, we should incarcerate them until we can decide exactly what their involvement has been and which punishment they deserve, and they clearly merit a harsh punishment. As distasteful as it is to us, we cannot disperse that judgment upon them right now. We simply do not dare to alert the demonologist that we are aware of his presence among us. As such, you will need to convince the brothers on your own initiative and as best you can. But we will be able to provide you with some trusted help.
He looked me straight in the eye, sincerity clear on his face.
If you believe this task will pose a problem for you, please say so, and we will apply for outside help. Certainly, since this would be both expensive and time-consuming, we would prefer to avoid that path.
I took a moment considering the task at hand. I'd have to convince a couple of hardened criminals and murderers to give up their demonologist friend, who'd in all likelihood be able to make the rest of their life a living hell if he wasn't stopped. And I couldn't out them to the rest of the community, use violence, or throw them in jail. But nobody said I wasn't allowed to lie. I turned on my brightest grin and announced, "It won't be a problem." The meeting was concluded right thereafter, but before I left, Mallard asked for a quiet moment. He patted me on the arm and came straight to the point. "Archangelo, you'll notice that I haven't given you any rewards. My reasoning should be, as always, impeccable. I asked you to figure out what's impairing the trade, which you did, but also why, which you still need to do." He stared at me, as if daring me to disagree, and when I didn't, the quest description was quite clear on that point, which left me with no reason to bitch and moan. He nodded to himself. He turned to leave, and as a parting note, he winked and shot over his shoulder. "Of course, you'll notice nobody mentioned exactly who talked the rest of the council into getting you a reward in the first place, right?" I just stared at his retreating back. Damn, that really was one stand-up guy. The next half hour found me walking the streets of Grant's Crossing, soul-searching and considering how best to handle the situation. Once I'd reached the general decision on how to approach the dwarven psychos, I was just preparing my arguments, counter-arguments, and how to best catch their attention and keep them from thinking. A light fog grew, but I was whistling as I went around in circles. I was looking forward to this. I wasn't usually the type to actively seek confrontations, but these bastards had it coming. I was going to milk it for all it was worth. I had one detour to make, and got it over and done with quickly. My backup, good old Othel, was lounging about at the village gate. He agreed to do what I asked of him with little discussion, since the mayor had already cleared everything with him. 2 minutes of chatting, and I marched on. It was time to stare down a couple of dwarves. When I reached the Blood Brothers building, I paused with my hands on the entrance door, savoring the moment. And then I pulled open the door and strode in as if I owned the place. The two brothers were in the middle of a card game, with weapons and empty dishes and cups strewn all over the table. A very familiar scene. They spotted me and both froze for a short moment before fake smiles appeared on their faces, and Herbert stood up with a welcoming gesture, civil as anything. "Sit down, Herbert. You're embarrassing yourself," I said, and sat down at the table myself, unable to keep a huge grin from my face. When I turned my head, I could see that Herbert was still standing there, now with a confused look to him as if unsure how to act or respond. I cut the humor from my voice. "I came here directly from a meeting with the council. I said sit!" Herbert grudgingly sat down, and I plastered the smile back on my face. See? That wasn't so hard, now was it? There's no reason to be uncivil to each other. I gathered their cards from the table and slid the rest of the stuff to the floor. No reason to refrain from being a provocative asshole right then and there. "Allow me to lay the cards on the table for you," I said, and picked out 2 jacks, placing them on the table in front of us. "Here you are. You've chosen to ally yourselves with some dark forces. This has been a shitty experience for Grant's Crossing, but a wonderful journey for you. So far." Herbert started saying something, but I spoke over him, repeating in a louder voice, "So far." I tossed 3 kings and a queen haphazardly to the table. "This is the council. For now, they are the only ones who know about you and your unfortunate alliance." Herbert still acted the innocent, but I caught sight of Berthold's hand twitching slightly towards the dagger on his belt. A joker was added on top of the lot. "Your friend out in the woods. The big question mark. He knows that we're aware he's out there, but remains blissfully oblivious to the fact that the council knows about you." I took all the remaining cards and spread them in a circle around the 2 jacks. "The rest of Grant's Crossing. Now, I wonder what their reaction would be if they were told that you are responsible for all the hardships they've suffered over the past few years." I bent down and picked up a dagger, slamming it down point first, pinning the cards of small denomination to the table. Both the dwarves sprang back, and Berthold looked to be inches from jumping me. I adopted an affected tone. "So sorry about that, but I was short an extra set of cards. This," I pointed to the dagger, "is the group of defender guards and mages arriving in 4 weeks to take down your shadowy friend. And you, should you decide to jump ship." At this point, I was straight out lying my ass off, but I wanted them both off guard, and the defender guards from Chertog's pamphlet had sounded like an impressive bunch. I leaned back on my chair and stared at the dwarves for a while. Both were staring at the table, Herbert sweating and pale, while Bertold was fuming and looked to be fighting to keep his temper. Bertold ground his teeth and said,
"We don't know what you're talking about. We've never done it."
"Don't you dare!" I interrupted him, snarling. "Don't you dare claim you're innocent. I've seen your cozy little camp down near the summoning circle. I've seen the looted corpses of the caravans. I know you've been pawning off the items you looted at the merchant house. In fact, if you try to claim your innocence, I swear I'll take this place apart, and I know I'll find evidence in here. Don't freaking dare!" I practically growled near the end. Admittedly, I lost my temper a little, and I really had no authority at all in the place, but Bertold was ticking me off. I really felt the need to put him in his place. Bertold just stared at me menacingly, but Herbert's head kept swerving to the right. So, yeah, good educated guess. They definitely had hidden loot in the house. "Now, I want to make myself clear," I said, trying to infuse my voice with authority. "As long as you admit to your crimes and answer any questions I have, the council has agreed to be magnanimous and let you live for the time being, as long as you do not warn our shadowy friend about the hunters. There will be a reckoning, however, when this is all over and done with." I spread my arms in inquiry to the two and asked, "Any questions? All good here so we can get on with what I need to know?" This seemed to wake Herbert up, and he grumbled a bit and asked,
"This reckoning, what'll it mean for us?"
"No clue. Could be some fines you'll have to pay, a few years of prison, some seizure of property, something like that." I waved one hand dismissively. His scowl deepened.
"Seizure of property? You're saying they'll take our home and lock us up?"
I smirked. "Hey, I don't make the decisions here. It's all up to the council. If it were up to me, I'd probably just let the town people get their revenge on you, but hey, seems they're pretty forgiving people in the council. They did ask me to make entirely certain that you'd understand the basics, though. Trying to warn the demonologist will officially turn you into targets to be killed on sight." Both of the brothers seemed to have become a bit more subdued, and even though Bertold still had a wild look in his eyes, at least his hands weren't hovering over his dagger anymore. I rubbed my hands together in anticipation. "All right, my turn. First question, why? Why in the name of Saroon would you try to join me on my travels, Bertold?" Bertold looked at his feet, mumbling something indecipherable. "I'm up here, Bertold. Speak up already."
"Because you're a thrice-cursed reborn, all right?"
he yelled, and continued at a lower tone of voice, still visibly agitated.
"Everybody knows that you lot are unpredictable, violent, God's damned nosy bastards, and—"
He shrugged, eyes cast down.
"We thought that if I were to join you, I'd lead you on a merry, long, and boring chase till you got bored and skipped town. Course, that didn't work due to that prissy kid getting the spot."
I nodded. "All right, answers, I like it. And you, Herbert? Why in the pits would you volunteer the location where you'd been attacking the caravans?" He looked me straight in the eyes and said,
"Wasn't it me idea? But I didn't actually lead you to one of the ambush points. We were just unfortunate that it was nearby. Place I took you to, it'd be easy for someone to guide you instead to this perfect place we know. A place where we could safely observe a large pack of huge wolves gnawing on, bones."
I took a second, allowing his comment to sink in before responding. "Why would— of course, this would trick me to believe that the disappearances were likely due to monster attacks and not your influence. All right. It'd probably also have worked, to tell the truth. See how well we're doing? Now, for the final and most important question, or questions. This certain someone you mention, is this our resident demon invoker?" And who is it?" The brothers looked at each other. Bertold was scowling, and Herbert clearly nervous. Herbert looked down first, and Bertold turned his glare on me, challenging me.
"Why would we tell you? The council isn't going to do anything about us. You said so yourself."
This was exactly what I feared. I had no real heft in this situation, no authority. It was time to up the stakes. I gave him my best shit-eating grin and roared with laughter. "You said it yourself, didn't you? I'm a reborn. I don't care about your silly little rules or the council. I'll just go straight out there and tell the truth to the nearest person I see. And then, when you're dangling from the nearest tree, I'll laugh. Sure, they won't find your pal that way, but I'll leave that up to the hunters to find later on." Bertold's nostrils flared in anger, and he glared at me.
"You wouldn't dare."
I stared right back at him, trying not to show how my heart was pounding. "Try me, you murdering little runt. To me, that would be the best kind of justice." He kept up his stare a moment longer until he finally slammed his fist down on the table and looked away. The silence stretched on until he finally whispered,
"Sourpuss,"
in a resigned voice. The name exploded to the forefront of my mind. Of course he was the one. A complete loner with no friends who was known to go into the woods whenever the mood suited him. And he'd also offered to join my group. That lying, deceiving, fur-faced bastard. I thought about it a bit further and mused. "So, when you led me to that spot and told me I should seek out someone who'd be able to help you with these things?" He grunted.
"You'd accidentally bump into Sourpuss when you got back. Except you haired off somewhere instead and ruined everything."
I bared my teeth. "Excuse me if I have trouble coming up with a heartfelt apology. Now, one final question, and I won't be troubling you again. Will Sourpuss be able to raise or summon something else within the next couple of days?" They chewed over that for a while, until Bertold said,
"I doubt it. Nothing useful, at least. It took him a long time to raise Hyberus to the strength and intelligence that he'd acquired, and he'd need to start all over."
I got up and bowed to them. "All right. Herbert, Bertold, I appreciate your forthrightness, and will speak in your favor to the council should the possibility arise. Good day." When I closed the door behind me, I carefully kept my hands folded in front of me in order to hide just how much they were shaking. What an adrenaline rush! At the same time, that was the most frightening thing I'd ever done. Walking into a room with two criminals who I knew would want to hurt me and start bossing them around, and somehow I managed to keep them from discovering that I was bluffing all the while? Gods, if moments were women, I'd have made love to this one. A pop-up showed that my blackmail skill had just gone up one level. Not exactly a skill I'd ever thought I'd be using. But then again, the way things were going, I might end up using it on a regular basis. I kinda wanted a break, but did take the time I needed to make my rounds and get the most pressing quest parts over with. I went back to Mallard and relayed the bad news on our deceitful feline. He clearly didn't like it, but didn't dispute my findings. Obviously, it made sense to him as well, distasteful though it may have been. He told me that he'd arrange for some assistance with capturing Sourpuss the day after, around 9 a.m., and that he'd appreciate the help of our group in case of trouble. I told him I'd do my best. I really wanted to be around as well. If Sourpuss went berserk, he could do some real damage. An hour later, Lyle and I had visited Daria in her camp, enlightening her on the developments and the showdown in the morning. We agreed to meet for breakfast in the tavern and take the council's lead for the confrontation itself. With that, I was done for the day, not only with the most urgent quests, but mentally as well. Speaking to many people didn't faze me, but the need to apply my brain as diligently as I had in so uncommon situations had me feeling wrung out. For once, I really didn't need to be around people. And, hell, it's not like I needed any extra gear, apart from what I was always carrying in my inventory. I had my warm cape, my violin, and some bread and water in case I was starving. With that part well in hand, I took a slow stroll through the woods until I was standing on top of the hill of the old Warlock's tower. A deep sigh seemed to flow through my entire body, and I slowly turned full circle, enjoying the view of the surrounding forest landscape. Everything seemed so remote and peaceful from up here. The mist was spread out unevenly over the landscape and gave the setting a dreamy look. I lovingly caressed my violin and just stood for a while, enjoying the fresh air of the afternoon. After a while, I sighed again and started playing, promptly losing myself. A lot of people drink or do drugs to forget or escape the humdrum day-to-day trivialities. This is my drug of choice, except of course for when I drink. However, when I'm well and truly lost in my own mind, pouring my emotions into my instrument and playing whatever crosses my fancy, I'm momentarily able to turn off that part of my mind that tends to be churning in the background, procrastinating about whatever worries might be on my mind at the time. For a while there on the hillock, I forgot all about the drama and trouble in Grant's Crossing, my erstwhile dream about living a life of luxury and hangers-on, and even managed to disregard the distant ghost of a certain mob boss and his cronies. When hours later I lowered my violin, I was left with a buzzing, pleasant feeling, and that slightly guilty feeling you can get sometimes when you treat yourself to something good. The 2 increases to musician definitely didn't subtract from my warm, fuzzy feelings. After a moment's contemplation, I decided, hell. I might as well go all in and dedicate the rest of the day to indulging myself. 20 minutes later found me whistling on the way to my room, balancing a huge plate of meat, gravy, and taters in one hand, and some huge tome on history that Gilm allowed me to borrow to keep me company in the other. I did manage to read the first chapter while I ate, but afterwards, I believe that I was asleep within a page or two. I woke up somewhere around midnight to the sound of something ticking repeatedly on the window pane, but in my sleep-befuddled state, I just mumbled, "Oh, you an encore, dude," crashed back to the bed, and promptly fell asleep. Chapter 28. Uncomfortable Conclusions. Fantasy games and literature in general operate with a number of tropes I've never been able to entirely understand. Elves are naturally thin. Why? Do they hate ice cream? Dragons love gold and gems. Apparently it's sort of an ergonomically optimal mattress to them. Would it be possible to maybe make a really lucrative trade if you had, say, 20 metric tons of cotton, a few hundred seamstresses, and buckets of glitter for that shiny effect? Also, for some reason, most fantasy worlds can only brew tea, not coffee. Whatever else I might blame exogenics for, introducing coffee to their world was surely reason enough to praise their design team. These were among the profound thoughts I was pondering while I slowly woke up at breakfast alongside Lyle and Daria. Not many words were spoken, but at least the silence didn't feel forced. I wouldn't say we had bonded or anything remotely similar, but Daria didn't display the open hostility she'd shown the first few times. This might be due to me not acting like a manipulative arse in front of her recently, but I wasn't awake enough for that level of introspection. We were approaching the agreed-upon time when Ethel popped his head in the door, spotted us, and ran over to our table. Panting, he burst out, "Come with me, quickly!" We all rose to follow him, and he spoke as we moved.
"I've just made the rounds, and we're all moving directly to the house now."
I was very relieved that the council had agreed to provide us the assistance of Ethel for the time being. He'd spent the night keeping watch on the brethren, making sure that they didn't run straight to Sourpuss, telling our plans. While I felt pretty comfortable in the thought that Ethel wouldn't have been able to help me in my interrogation of the dwarves, I had maintained some doubts about what the dwarves would choose to do once there was no obvious pressure on them, and they were seemingly left without supervision. While they had actually stayed in their house instead of running directly off to alert Sourpuss, more than I'd expected of the double-crossing bastards, it felt good knowing that he'd been there all the while, keeping the bastard from learning of our plans. Sourpuss's house was an ill-kept monstrosity of a cabin placed close to the white-capped waters of the Jagged Rush, but as far away from any other buildings in Grant's Crossing as the wooden palisade would allow for. He also had a number of other contraptions nearby for handling pelts, drying fish, as well as a couple of permanent fishing nets, and an additional shed that was almost the same size as his house. All of these in way better condition than his actual abode. The smell was something else, though. I'd never had the pleasure of experiencing the aromas of a tanner's livelihood up close, and the sudden realization hit me that I really didn't feel a need to linger any longer than necessary. When we arrived, it seemed that half the town had already arrived. The entire council was standing a ways off from the door, and boy, were they packing. Atoria was decked out in all sorts of arcane paraphernalia, and Mr. Callahan was clad in ornate bronze armor, cutting an impressive figure, which was only slightly ruined by the fact that the armor looked really tight on him. Gillum had the law, his large wooden mace in his hands, and wore dark leather armor, lending him quite the swashbuckling look, and for once Mallard was attired in priestly garb, carrying a large staff. At the door, Kip had just started pounding on the door, demanding that Sourpuss open the door while the two brawny half-orcs I'd seen handling the river crossing before were right behind him, swords in hand. I instantly broke out in sweat. Any decent movie would have the villain leveling the door right around that moment, and the three brawny dudes blown away while the real boss fight started. Except nothing remotely similar happened. Sourpuss opened the door slightly, bared teeth, and an angry expression on his face, but any exclamation died on his lips, along with any desire to attempt an escape the moment he spotted all the people who'd shown up to help subdue him. He went along quietly, which I'd very much not anticipated. While his face was grim and his body language spoke volumes about the fury bottled up inside him, his mouth was closed tightly, and he offered nothing. No threats, no protestations of innocence, nothing at all. This behavior clashed harshly with the image that was still burned vividly in my subconscious, a laughing, theatrical maniac with a serious bad guy syndrome and a thing for speeches. But nevertheless, he was escorted without incident back to the harbor master's home. Ethel, meanwhile, told me that the smith and Atoria had been up all night embellishing on one of the two existing prison cells of the village in order to ensure that he'd be completely unable to escape, both via mundane and magical means. The entire experience was horribly anticlimactic. We were all dressed up, with no one to kill. How extremely inconsiderate of Sourpuss. Lyle seemed pretty happy with the way everything had panned out. I suspect the thought of hurting someone who'd been providing you with meat and fish your entire life hadn't exactly felt thrilling to him. Daria took off quickly. We'd accomplished what we set out to do, and staying for the social niceties didn't really seem to be her thing, so I didn't take it to heart. As for me, in short succession I was left bored and without anything compelling to do right that moment, which is probably why I found myself gravitating back to Sourpuss's house. It definitely wasn't because I felt the need to spend more time in the numbing fragrances of Sourpuss's tanning activities, but something didn't sit right with me about the whole thing, apart from the stench. Now, I understood the Blood Brothers buckling under the pressure I'd applied, along with the supposed small army of hunters out for their asses if they didn't give. But why on earth would Sourpuss cave without a fight? With what he'd supposedly done, he would either be executed right off the bat or would never see daylight again. I wasn't that informed about how severe a legal system they had around here, if any. No, I saw only two realistic possibilities. One, he had been surprised by the takedown but had planned ahead for something similar and intended to flee later. Made sense, but whatever else you could say about the old Ice Queen Atoria, I'd never heard anybody doubt the quality of her magical abilities. He'd probably be disappointed in his eventual escape attempt. Two, Sourpuss was innocent and had become the victim of a clever and crafty setup. Of course, there was a third option as well, that he was the culprit, only he'd chickened out at seeing the heavy opposition arrayed against him. My gut feeling was telling me nay on this one, however. The difference between the megalomaniacal villain with a sense for drama and the dour feline was just too large. I stood in front of Sourpuss's front door for a moment, considering my options. While I had a hunch something about the situation might be fishy, I wasn't entirely ready for breaking and entering. Fortunately, I heard sounds from within the cabin and stuck my head in where I spotted Mallard busy going through all of Sourpuss's belongings. Apparently, he had volunteered for the dirty job of gathering evidence. Evidence which would be assessed by the council, who would also decide and arrange for the judgment. Mallard listened to my reason for returning without judging me and promptly enrolled me in the search, as he stated, "The sooner I can get back into fresh air, the better." The main and only room in the cabin was a wreck and only served to convince me further that something was wrong. Everything looked like the setting of your average college dorm room on a Sunday. Old plates and empty bottles were everywhere, along with the heavy stench of cheap liquor, which even served to overpower the tanning fumes. It didn't appear that Sourpuss owned much of value. A few sets of rumpled, smelly clothes, along with a collection of surprisingly lifelike carved wooden animals. Our search brought nothing of value at all, and we agreed to check on his shed before we called it quits. Before we could move on, we had to spend a while extra searching through the exploded mess of a cabin because the next door shed was locked with a heavy-duty padlock. Mallard finally located the key in a jar labeled pickles, of all things. When we entered the shed, it almost felt like a different world. The shed was meticulously kept and recently cleaned, as were the tool benches and work clothes. The numerous tools were fixed on the walls, all in their proper place, and the result, when compared to the earlier chaos, was slightly schizophrenic. Mallard walked through the shed, gawking. He turned around and indicated the room to me, asking, "What is this?" I scratched my head and ventured, "Beats me. Either he keeps the work and his regular life really separate, or he keeps his cabin like that on purpose in order to cover up whatever's in here." Mallard nodded, and we went to work. This time, our search was a hell of a lot easier than going through the cabin, as even the contents of the cupboards were properly arranged. 5 minutes were all we needed to confirm that Sourpuss was hiding nothing horrendous, and the only thing remaining was the trap door that led down to Sourpuss's root cellar. One word: jackpot. The visual effect of it wasn't too far from a horror movie. The root cellar was stuffed with dead animals arranged for storage on hooks, some of them already butchered and prepared, others untreated and surprisingly lifelike. 2 male deer staring accusingly at me, suspended from the hind quarters as they were, dripping their remaining blood into bowls placed under their expertly sliced necks. Behind them, and right underneath a brace of hares, we stared at what appeared to be a frighteningly familiar arrangement. On the floor, surrounded by candles, arcane symbols had been painted in a 6-pointed star, and a small leather-bound book was wrapped in an oilskin right next to it to keep the cold of the root cellar from affecting it. Also my damn necklace! Seriously, the bastard had taken the time to affix the necklace around the neck of a pheasant, which made for one pretty damn gruesome sight. Mallard and I just stood there for a while, taking in the gruesome details. And then he snapped up the book, I took my necklace, and by silent agreement, we did a cursory inspection of the rest of the root cellar before we hurried out, taking care to lock the shed behind us. We walked aimlessly along the jagged rush until we'd escaped the worst of the odors, and stood for a while without talking in companionable silence, staring at the white-flecked waters streaming by. Mallard was the first one to talk. He was holding the book he'd found and quoted the title. "A Treatise on Shadows and Shades." So, it definitely was Sourpuss. I stared at the waters as a small tree floated by at impressive speeds. Sure looks like it. It looked like a squirrel or some other critter was trapped among the branches of the tree, rushing towards an uncertain future. I wasn't entirely sure why, but I made a decision right then. "Mallard, you remember when you asked me to help you the first time? You had some gut feelings that you couldn't ignore, but were unable to come up with a decent explanation for what was wrong? And that's why you asked me to look into the whole damn thing?" "Sure, Arcangelo. I'm not going to forget that right away." "That's my problem. Something about this just feels off, and I don't know where to start." He mulled that over in silence for a while until he said, "Catch," and tossed the book in my direction. "You do what it takes until that voice quiets right down, and if you find something, I'll listen. Won't promise I'll agree, but I'll listen. Oh, and I'll need that back when you're done." He hemmed and hawed for a bit before concluding, "I reckon you'll have 2 days at the most until we're laying the judgment on Sourpuss." I thanked him profusely and promised to keep him updated on any discoveries I might make along the way, and then moved back to my tavern room for a concentrated dose of reading and thinking. Once I'd gotten myself comfortably installed in my bed, with a large pitcher of chilled tether juice, strange-looking fruit with a taste somewhere between blackcurrant and watermelon, I got started on the book. Reading and plotting. This was turning out quite differently from the type of day I'd been expecting. Half an hour later, I put down the book, severely disappointed. Deep down, I'd hoped that the book would be an introduction to shadow magic, or whatever it was called in World of Chains. Then, I theorized, I would perhaps be able to learn the basics and be able to introduce some severely needed stealth elements to my modus operandi. Supposedly, Exogenics figured that this would have been too much wish fulfillment since the book was more of a philosophical discussion on the nature and state of shadows. Philosophy had never been my strong point, or even particularly interesting to me. It had always seemed to me that people who dedicated their lives to philosophy just really liked to debate instead of actually arriving at an answer at some point. The book did have some interesting theories, however. The first was the part about shadows being a physical manifestation of the borders between this world and others, and a theory about manipulating shadows to actually create pathways. This theory went well with the swirling shadows that had been present at the summoning circle in the ruins. The second interesting part was how shadows were closely associated with the goddess of shadows and personal ambition, Laia Yan, and how shadow manipulators who followed her teachings were typically more adept at handling shadows. As for anything that might either further condemn or redeem Sourpuss, nothing. Not a hint. One increase to my magic lore skill, but nothing useful. I wondered why I was even still looking into this. Evidence was stacked high against Sourpuss, and it's not like he had tons of friends to defend him. But there were just a bunch of details that didn't sit right with me. First off, everything about Sourpuss just screamed loner, from the devastation in his cabin to his reputation in the village and to his every behavior. Was this the type of person to team up with the Garterson duo? Second, nothing in his cabin or shed had indicated that he liked to or even knew how to read. We'd located a bunch of wood cuts indicating the prime cuts on different animals, but not a single piece of paper, book, or anything written except from the book. Third, the most compelling detail for me, when Sourpuss came to me and told me how he'd wanted to join me in aiding the village, I'd bloody well believed him. Bertold had given me the chills right off the bat, though admittedly his brother's charisma had won me over, but Sourpuss's argument had seemed heartfelt and genuine. Not exactly what you'd call hard evidence, but it'd have to do. This left me at an impasse, and as usual, when I'm left without any useful starting point or knowledge, I turned to the real teachers of my formative years, actors. If there was one thing the original NYPD Blues series had taught me, it was to always look for means, motive, and opportunity. Now, motive would remain a question mark until I'd actually learned what the hell they were up to, apart from sacrificing people in the woods for personal gain, of course. Asking the Blood Brothers for further information would remain a dubious affair. If they'd already lied about Sourpuss, they'd probably keep it up. Means and opportunity, however, were an entirely different discussion. The list of people from Grant's Crossing who'd have the means to set up the entire operation and pull it off for years without being detected, as well as the opportunity to regularly elope from their usual doings to haunt the woods and supposedly perform lengthy summoning sessions, would likely be rather short. And with that, I was suddenly entirely aware of how to proceed. I needed answers, and if there was one thing I'd learned over the past couple of weeks, it was this. In a small village like Grant's Crossing, if anything the least bit interesting happens, the village awakens to chatter and gossip. I could have learned any number of new things about Sourpuss and his crimes that day. Scratch supposed crimes in this crowd. The public opinion of Sourpuss was not favorable, including a good bunch of tales that were either very improbable or plain make-believe. This I knew to expect, and I didn't expect to learn anything useful about Sourpuss or his behavior or whereabouts. What I did expect, and received in full, were plenty of opportunities to introduce seemingly innocuous questions. Seriously, it's been years. How come no one has caught him red-handed in the forest, by accident if nothing else? Other people have seen shadow magic around lately? Do tell. What do you mean, almost no one goes into the forest regularly? Yeah, of course I know it's dangerous, but it's all forest here, right? After almost an hour of socializing and chatting with people, I'd made huge progress, and what had seemed like an insurmountable task to begin with had been boiled down to a list of only 6 people who entered the forest regularly for long periods at a time, long enough to be able to perform the attacks. Discounting the Dwarven brothers as well as Daria, who'd only been around for the last 3 months' time, I was actually down to 3 possible perpetrators. Needless to say, Sourpuss headed the list, but the other 2 alternatives had surprised the hell out of me: Navis and Othel. I had a hard time picturing either of the 2 committing gruesome crimes of their own volition. But then again, my troubles picturing the dour-faced Sourpuss in the same position was what brought me to my current line of investigation anyway. I returned to the tavern for lunch. Gillum was working early today, and as he brought me my meal, he dropped a note on my table along with a hearty slap on the back. The contents of the note were extremely limited, a number of dates and a scribbled note on top.
Mallard said you could probably use a little help. You owe me. It's the dates that the caravans that have disappeared left the village.
I almost started cheering out loud right then and there. Damn, what a friend. Finally, I'd have a realistic way of proving the innocence or guilt of the remaining 3 suspects, and I didn't even have to confront them and warn the entire town what I was up to. Whatever Gillum might conceivably ask for would be a cheap price to pay for his well-timed assistance. Sitting still for the remainder of my meal was something of a task. Suddenly I was jittery, filled with energy and wanting nothing more than getting started right away. I knew just where to start, too. A bit later, I was trudging through the woods on the lookout for Daria. The clearing where her camp was located was empty, but as luck would have it, she returned just when I attempted applying my meager tracking skills to figure out where she'd gone. It was a good thing, too. I had been able to locate a few solid tracks where I felt certain in my knowledge that they were pretty recent, but deciding which of those tracks were the freshest was still way beyond me. When we spoke, Daria was strangely quiet, almost subdued, compared to the latest days. Thankfully, she instantly agreed to help me in my endeavors and took the whole thing seriously. She did look fairly anxious perusing the list of dates, but when she got halfway through, her face lit up and she flashed me a brilliant smile.
I knew it! Here, Navis couldn't possibly have been part of this attack. We were traveling the woods for 3 days at that date, looking for morning flush.
To be honest, my sense of relief was almost tangible. Of the 3 persons on the list, Navis had the most innocent persona, and confronting her with my accusations was not something I wanted to do. Now I was down to 2 possible culprits, and while I didn't want to face Ethel without any hard evidence, I might have to at some point. I spent a while chatting with Daria, discussing which options were available, and when I left a bit later, she'd volunteered her help if ever I'd need to face off with him. On my way back to the village, I marveled at how my relationship with Daria had rapidly become cordial. If it continued like this, I might be able to convince her to join Lyle and me on a more permanent basis. We could very well do with some increased damage-dealing ability in combat, and she was an impressive force of nature. I had 2 options remaining to me before I'd have to make some decisions, and they both proved completely useless. The first was talking to Gillum for more information on Ethel and his schedules, and the second was talking directly to Sourpuss about helping him. Talking to Gillum did bring me some information at least, namely the fact that Ethel's nickname was Mayor's Little Helper, and that no information would be available from her side unless under serious duress. Talking to Sourpuss just wasn't going to happen. They limited all access to him in his cell, and they only had a single questioning session, closed to the council, of course, planned before the eventual judgment. At some point early in the afternoon, I'd gravitated to a corner of the tavern where I was mulling over my conundrum with a large chilled ale to help me chill down my forehead and throat. It wasn't just the one quest. I was putting all the other quests on the back burner for the time being, what with the narrow time frame I was working under, but some of these quests turned out to be interconnected, sometimes in surprising ways. Therefore, I wondered whether the demonologist could also be the person who killed Gillum's mother and decided to get back to this if Sourpuss turned out to be the culprit. The killer couldn't have been Ethel himself, given how few years he'd spent in the town, but the jury was still out on Sourpuss. Ethel and Sourpuss. Sourpuss and Ethel. Opposites in almost all aspects. One was short, the other tall, one was an extrovert, the other an introvert, one a chatty, happy camper, and the other decidedly not. One of these 2 personas was a fake, a fantasy created for the sole purpose of convincing the townspeople of the simple nature of a personality that was way deeper than the one shown to the world. The real demonologist was intelligent, devious, and determined enough to keep his real personality hidden for years on end, and arrogant. Just like that, I was struck by the lightning of inspiration, and my mind started spinning furiously with the implications and methods I'd have to apply. All right, if I couldn't prove for certain that either of them was our resident demonologist, I'd go for the second best result, forcing the villain to expose himself. Now, since Sourpuss was forcibly off-limits for the remainder of his, in all likelihood, very short lifespan, this meant Ethel. If Ethel was truly the culprit, I might just have an inkling of how to force his dark, dirty secret out in the open. The villainous personality I'd met was bestowed with enough arrogance that he'd likely feel entirely certain he'd be able to keep up his facade, whatever happened, due to his intelligence. Also, he'd probably hold to an understandable conviction that the clever tricks he'd pulled in order to frame Sourpuss, plus his connection to Atoria and ability to guide her, would be enough to ensure that everything would go over smoothly. With that in mind, maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't have to procure any evidence but only needed to convince him of the error of his assumptions and provide him with enough rope to hang himself. There were a lot of ifs involved, and I'd most likely have to bluff. A lot. And coat my bluffs with a thin sheet of lies. But hell, it was the first time I felt that I was actually getting somewhere. And if Ethel truly was the demonologist, every half-truth, bluff, or flat-out lie would only be a soft-hearted precursor to the karmic ass-kicking he really deserved. I bent my mind to the task at hand, and the plotting deepened. Chapter 29. Beginning of the End. Suddenly, I felt as if I were back at the beginnings of my current adventure. I was working with a very inflexible deadline, too little time to prepare properly, and I didn't really have any idea what I was doing. I had to admit, though, that even with what was at stake and the huge possibilities of failing or doing something irredeemably stupid, such as accusing a completely innocent person of something horrendous, I was having fun. I was aware that the implications this had regarding my personality likely weren't too flattering, but decided to ignore that for the time being, or indefinitely, if need be. The first part of my to-do list was basically, how do I convince the supposed wicked demonologist that I've got it all figured out? I did this in the same way I usually prepare for conversations I know are going to be difficult. Play back the entire conversation in my head beforehand, imagining as many possible permutations and reactions as possible, and the optimal response I'd be able to deliver. I am aware that this might sound almost impossible, but having some clever replies prepared can be a major factor in steering the conversations in the way you wanted them to go. I was in no way a world-class debater, but I'd spent enough time on small stages around Copenhagen, and especially in the bars afterwards, that I knew how to avoid the worst pitfalls. This time around, I mostly tried to prepare arguments that steered away from inconvenient subjects. Evidence, for one, and blindsided him with angles he hadn't considered. I didn't allow myself to spend as much time on this part as I'd like. I was pressingly aware I wanted to push for a confrontation as soon as possible, preferably this very night. I could theoretically wait until the day after, but seeing as how Mallard had said 2 days at most, I really didn't want to push it. On top of this, the next part of planning would require more effort and more help, the practical side. For this, I gathered Lyle and Daria and asked for their help. Hell, I would have begged for it if necessary. Neither of them were happy with the short notice, but they did accept my argumentation and helped me with the planning. And the next hours flew by, first with the ideas, theories, and stratagems, and afterwards with the actual practical work of prepping a place of battle to make sure that the ground favored our trio as much as possible. In the middle of everything, I finally recalled the leadership point I still hadn't used, and instantly applied it to Magic Resistance 1. Magic damage taken is reduced by 10%. Unfortunately, I didn't have another point ready for the next one in this path. Resist Magic Effects 1. Chance to resist magical status effects like Charm, Curse, Confusion, and similar effects increased by 10%. We spared no materials, utilizing everything we had available, and when we returned to the village for a late and rushed dinner, we were covered in dirt and pretty worn out from our exertions. I urged the others to grab a quick shower and then prepare their gear while I ran a few last-minute errands, trying to arrange for a bit of last-minute help. Despite my hopes and the fact that he was the one who originally set me moving on the path that'd be leading to the night's showdown, Mallard refused to lend a hand in any battle. He wouldn't go directly against Atoria's favorite without clear proof of any wrongdoing. As I turned away, disappointed, he added, as if musing out loud, "Thinking about the safety of some of my friends is another thing, though. I reckon if somebody asked nicely, I might know a protective spell that could aid a group about to head out into danger." His huge grin almost reached his bald pate, and I couldn't help but laugh. My last resort, Gillum, was equally unwilling to participate directly, but he did agree to help us with the final piece of the puzzle. And with that done, I returned to Daria and Lyle. We'd reconvened around 10 in the evening, completed our last-minute checks, and were about to head out to see Mallard and disperse to our agreed places when Gillum joined our table with 3 foaming tankards. He smiled and waved off our thanks, speaking right over our heads.
I don't need to know anything. For your sake and mine. This is for your intentions. Risking yourselves to help the village deserves praise.
With that, he walked off. We toasted to the night's success, drank deeply, and with that, we were off. A short visit with Mallard netted us a beautiful buff. 30% protection from all magical damage, duration 6 hours. After receiving that, we separated to prepare for our parts. My path took me on a short detour past the Blood Brothers, where I bullied them for a brief moment, and left them with a task and a sealed letter addressed to a certain Ethel Bellaris. And then I left as quickly as possible, in order to make sure that we were all in place. We'd chosen the hill with the ruins of the Warlock's Tower for our confrontation, both because it was close to the village, but also because it had all the characteristics we were looking for. A semi-steep hill that could be traversed from almost all sides with the forest close by. It also somehow felt right to me to engage in what could very well result in a defining battle on a site that had already been at the heart of so much drama for Grant's Crossing. Minutes later, I'd checked in with Daria and Lyle and moved on to place myself alone in the absolute center of the tower ruins, easily observed from all angles. The primary plan was to talk Ethel into surrendering peacefully, unrealistic though it may seem. I'd prefer to end this bloodlessly, and there might be some sort of compromise we could reach. The backup plan, if that failed, was to encourage Ethel, and possibly the Blood Brothers as well, to face me directly, in the hopes that they wouldn't think too deeply about the whereabouts of my companions. And, well, that was it. I believed that we were as prepared as we could be within the time frame we had available, and I settled in for a good wait. Ethel tarried in arriving. I must admit that I'd imagined that he'd come straight out to confront me, and I wasn't entirely sure whether this was a good development or not. Almost an hour after, I'd dumped off the letter, which, by the way, simply read, "I know your secret. Join me at the Warlock's Tower immediately. Arcangelo." Ethel emerged alone from the woods closest to the village and climbed up to meet me. He wasted no time on chit-chat.
I don't know what you're on about, Archie, but this really isn't my idea of a joke, and especially not in the middle of the night.
Even though he looked more angry than nervous, his tone of voice did hold a quaver of uncertainty in it, which would be entirely understandable for anybody who'd received an approach such as Ethel had. I won't waste your time here, Ethel. I saw no sense in prolonging the inevitable. I know you're the demonologist and the real mastermind behind the attacks on the caravan, and I wanted to see whether we'd be able to come to an agreement, or if you'd choose to attack me instead. His reaction wasn't entirely what I'd been looking for. Anger, denial, a straight-out attack, those I had all prepared for. But a full chuckle leading into full-throated laughter? Yeah, that took me by surprise. Of course, by the end, when he was wiping away tears and still chuckling quietly, he took a good look at my face and replied with a stunned look.
Gods abound. You're serious?
I simply nodded. He shook his head as if trying to clear it. If he really was the culprit, this was some world-class acting right here.
I can't believe I'm hearing this. Look, Archie, I'm not even going to try to respond to that insanity. I'm off to bed.
He turned to move away, and I saw my opportunity slipping away. I needed to act quickly. Ethel, give me 30 seconds to say my deal, and then you're free to leave. He hesitated, but didn't move. I took this as my chance and quickly started talking. The thing is, figuring you out was one thing. That part really wasn't too hard. No, figuring out how to counter your clever tricks with Sourpuss was the tough part. But I did it. So here's the deal. Even if I'm wrong and you're not the demonologist, you need to hear me out. Why? Because this is going down, and this moment here and now, is your only opportunity to do something about it until you get your punishment. This caught his attention. It was still too early to decide whether I was harassing an innocent, but at least he wasn't storming off. I continued, unabashed. First off, I'd like to say that I'm impressed. Getting away with this for so many years is quite the accomplishment. But I digress. What I really wanted to say is you've done an incredible job of framing Sourpuss. I can't imagine that the work involved was that hard. I mean, getting a key from a drunk and then planting a few items in his shed isn't really soul-breaking drudgery, but the effect of it is undeniable, and Sourpuss is the perfect victim, unlikable and a loner to boot. I threw my hands in the air for emphasis. I had a hell of a time looking for evidence against you or in favor of Sourpuss. It took me quite some time to come to a conclusion, which was that I don't really need any hard evidence. This got the first real reaction from him.
What in the pits do you mean? First you say that you're, what, going to frame it on me, and then you say you don't need any evidence? Make some sense, man.
I grinned. Operation Destroy Othel's self-confidence was a go. You might recall that I'm a bard, right? Bit hard to miss, of course. But what is it bards do? Most people answer play music or entertain, but that's only a small part of the whole. What we do is this. I leaned forward, speaking slowly and clearly for emphasis. We influence minds. Othel's eyebrows shot upwards, and I bared my teeth in a huge grin again, trying to be as aggravating as possible to keep him off kilter. I see you might just get what I'm aiming at. How about I do this? I'll run you through how a theoretical evening at the inn will pan out, and then I'll allow you to be the judge of whether I'm right or not. Othel had his arms crossed over his chest, and the look in his eyes was clearly angry by now, but he didn't stop me. I gestured expansively around me while talking, setting the scene. All right, picture this. It's 3 days from now. Saturday, in the evening, the busiest evening of the week in the tavern. Everybody's been fed, and a good bunch of people are getting into their cups. Sourpuss was hanged yesterday, and it's still fresh on the minds of all the people here. I start off with a song, something simple yet sad about the good old days, back when everything used to be better. Get people reminiscing a tad, then I'll start talking a bit to the crowd in between songs. Nothing too heavy yet, just some words about how I've heard so much good about the earlier days of Grant's Crossing, the entrepreneurial spirit, how everybody worked together, that kind of thing. Some few might even remember that Sourpuss was also around back then, feeding the village. Play an old song from the village, maybe. Following that, I start getting a bit more direct. Maybe say something about how you never really know people 100%. Everyone will, of course, assume that I'm talking about Sourpuss, but after that, I'll make a direct appeal to the crowd, tell them I need their help reconciling what I know with what's happened. The first thing I'll do then is, of course, sell out the Blood Brothers as an offering to the crowd. Tell everybody that they were part of the attacks and that the council knows but hasn't done anything. Maybe I'll even throw in some grisly details from the ruins to really get them on my side. This should get the crowd good and riled up, but I'll appeal to their better natures, ask for calm and for their assistance because I have further news. Othel still looked angry, but was he starting to look nervous as well? I couldn't tell and decided to power on. You did make one small error, you know. Sourpuss can't read. Leaving a book with him makes no sense at all, and there will be people out there who are aware of that fact. This is what I will ask them to confirm or deny, and then I'll start musing on a couple of other weird coincidences. How Sourpuss was in the village for almost a decade before he started his attacks, and how a loner such as him was able to talk the dwarves into joining him. At this point, Othel couldn't keep quiet any longer.
But this is all just so much nonsense, you can't back anything up.
I smiled innocently and winked. Oh, I know. Incidentally, this is where I mention you for the first time. Indirectly, but still. I'll list all the people in the village who actually spend enough time in the forest to be able to participate in all the attacks. And then, with the help of the crowd, of course, we'll scratch each name off the list one by one until there are just 2 names left. Sourpuss's and yours. Ethel's scowl had deepened into a hateful glare, which I took as encouragement. I scratched my jaw. You know, I'm not utterly convinced what to mention after that. There's a couple of possible paths I could choose. Mentioning that the attack started shortly after you came to the village 6 years ago? That's a good one. Maybe I should ask whether anybody's seen either you or Sourpuss in the company of the dwarves. Seem impartial and all. I waved off my considerations. I might just wing it. Anyway, once they've all decided that you're the culprit, somebody in the room might just cry out something along the lines of, "If the council won't do anything, I will!" And, well, I'm pretty certain the mood might just turn progressively darker after that. I brushed off my hands and looked at Ethel. So, what do you think? He burst out,
You can't do this, you bastard! The council won't stand for it! You'll hang as well!
I barked a laugh. Hang me? I'm a reborn, remember? Also, do you believe that they'll hang the rest of the village as well? It's not like I intend to get my hands dirty. He visibly deflated.
Why would you do something like this to me? I'm innocent!
Even though I felt extremely uncomfortable at his outburst, I shrugged and kept pushing. You just don't get it, do you? I'm a reborn. We make our own justice. His face fell, and he turned around. Just for a moment, I thought that I'd made him cry, but the sound that erupted from him was a low chuckle, increasing in strength. And when he turned around, he was composed once again, and even seemed to stand taller, looking me straight in the eye. When he spoke, even his voice seemed firmer, colder somehow.
Color me impressed, Arcangelo. That is cold-hearted, but I do believe that it would work.
He clapped theatrically and flashed a cold smile.
So, what is it you want? This is blackmail, correct?
I refrained from pumping my fists in celebration, barely, and responded in the same businesslike manner. Answers first, and then we can talk price. First question is pretty simple. Why do it? He looked at me as if I were a cockroach who'd inadvertently crawled right onto his dinner plate.
You cannot be unaware of... reborn. I suppose maybe you are.
He massaged his brow while looking at his feet.
Do you know the difference between a white and a black demonologist, to use the coarser terms?
I shrugged. I think so. The way I understand it, a white demonologist will use his own powers, body and blood, for the deals that he makes with whatever forces it is you actually deal with. A black one, on the other hand, will use that of others.
That's something of an oversimplification, but not entirely inaccurate. Now, given the huge difference between the behavior and lifestyle of the two types, what do you believe the difference is between the general treatment of a white and a black demonologist?
I considered this. Well, given the fact that...
None!
He interrupted me, the anger resonating from his voice.
Not the slightest God's-cursed difference. So when they ran me from home and I got here, and learned that nothing was different here with these ignorant backwater hicks, I decided I might as well take the easier route. To the pits with Grant's Crossing.
Now that was harsh. But then again, you probably shouldn't expect the most humanitarian worldview from a person who's been sacrificing people for his own gains. All right, I suppose I can understand that. Then what about the caravans and their goods? What happened to them?
I knew of a group who shared the same principles as I do, and they took the goods and surplus survivors off my hands in exchange for money and knowledge. I've profited vastly from this collaboration over the years.
His anger faded away, and his usual broad grin returned to his furry face, along with a hint of his usual kind demeanor.
This actually brings me full circle back to my question, Archie. What are you looking for? A payoff? Or do you just want in? Either way, we'll figure something out.
He laughed out loud.
Really, I'm sure that my friends can provide for you as well, regardless of what you seek. Money, knowledge, spells, or a ticket with invitations to the right circles.
I did a double take at that. I'd prepared myself well in advance for the eventual join the dark side speech, but I had no idea of the connections or cash he would have available. This merited some consideration. My initial reasons for entering the world of chains had been simple. I just wanted to enjoy myself, drown my worries in good wine, fine women, gambling, and music. So far, what I'd received only included one of those 4 elements, and now Ethel was basically telling me that he'd be prepared to make sure I'd receive the final 3. All it'd take would be for me to move on and leave Grant's Crossing, which I was already planning to do. Except, it wouldn't just mean leaving them, but abandoning them to the future depredations of our resident demonologist. I sighed. Ethel was right, really. The folks of Grant's Crossing were a bunch of ignorant, backward hicks. But somewhere along the line, they'd become my hicks. I knew very well that this was all just a game, but still, I'd made connections with many of the people in the village, and I'd be damned if I'd leave them at the mercy of this depraved, furry-assed bastard. An unbidden thought made me smile. Maybe looting Ethel would be considered karmic retribution for all the looting he'd performed over the years. I was going to give him this one chance, though. Ethel smiled back at me as he clearly misunderstood my intentions. Therefore, I simply said, "No."
What do you mean, no?
Just that. This is not a shakedown or an attempt to join your forces. This is me giving you the chance to surrender peacefully before I take you down by force. I'm willing to listen to any requirements you might have for yielding, but you will have to surrender to the authorities. I held up a hand to forestall his inevitable rejection. Please don't dismiss this before you've thought it through. Yes, the people of Grant's Crossing are ignorant and know next to nothing about the nuances of the outside world or demonologists. But behind all the gossip and lack of knowledge, they're good people. You've lived among them for 6 years. You know this. I could see his frown softening as he thought about my words and fired off my last shot. How about this? Wouldn't it be nice, for once, to actually be able to be yourself? No cover, no secrets, just you, Ethel. His face fell, and he stared at his feet for a bit. Maybe I'd gotten to him? When he looked back up, however, his expression was hardening and his eyes narrowed.
No, it's gotten too far. You don't know the things I've done.
Before I was able to counter that, Ethel inexplicably raised a hand over his head, making him look like a kid in school, waiting for permission from the teacher. I obliged. What is it, Ethel?
This? Oh, I didn't mean to ask you anything. I'm just signaling the others so we can put you out of commission and take you with us.
I looked behind me, and sure enough, Berthold was trudging up the hill next to... Is that a goddamn bear? But they said you wouldn't be able to summon anything for a while.
Oh my!
His teeth were very white in the moonlight, and the evil villain mask was back in full force.
They must have lied. How very unkind of them. Now, I'm afraid that Herbert was unable to join us due to a slight case of bleeding out. But we'll just have to make do.
His fingers performed a series of agile, precise movements while he muttered something under his breath, and shadows started swirling around him as they had the last time.
Now, I've read up on a ritual that should supposedly do away with even a reborn, and I'm itching to try it out. Any last words before we put you under?
That just had to be exaggeration. There was no way Exogenics had introduced some sort of ritual that could cause permadeath for a character. Right? I started slowly inching my way towards the edge of the hill. I guess there is one revelation I'd like to share with you before the situation escalates. I turned slightly to face the trio and activated my high tide skill. See, the thing is, I really should have recognized you back in the ruins, even with the robe and the shadows. How many persons are a meter tall and smell like a wet dog on a mitten? I had just a split second to register his look turning to sheer rage before my stun blast kicked in, and I enjoyed the vision of all 3 enemies tumbling to the ground. I should have just run. I really should have. The chance of ending the encounter quickly proved too much of a temptation for me, though, and my fingers danced over the strings as I cast Charm on Bertold. Inwardly, I cursed over the lengthy cast time, and my relief when the spell settled over Bertold's shoulders was instantly broken when he resisted the spell, even shaking and twitching on the ground as he was. Then I ran for my life. Some experiences are so bland and boring you'll forget them almost as soon as you've lived them, and others stay with you for your entire life. Sprinting down a muddy, grass-covered hill with all the speed I could muster on a dark, partially cloudy night, that one surely wasn't going to leave me anytime soon. I definitely would have stumbled and broken a leg within the first 10 meters if it weren't for 2 things. First, my half-elven descent granted me increased vision in low-light situations such as this, and second, earlier that day we'd planted a low row of white sticks in the ground to mark my way. Behind me, I could hear the 3 getting up. Bertold's cursing was quickly drowned out by a furious roar from the bear. I ran for dear life and nearly made it to the bottom of the hill unscathed when a shadowy wave clipped my shoulder and sent me sprawling. In short succession, I managed to hit one of the white sticks, followed by one of my own traps, and the ground. Damn, -1 agility. It's not as if I had plenty to spare, I thought as I forced myself to ignore the pain and scramble the remaining 10 meters to the tree line. Momentarily safe behind a tree, I equipped my violin and turned back to see the development, and a small smile formed on my lips. The trio had taken the most direct route down the hill, which basically meant straight through all the traps that I'd placed earlier that night. It looked like Bertold had taken the brunt of the traps because he'd already stumbled and plowed a long path in the ground with his face, and now the bear was struggling through the rest of them. My thoughts went, kind of them to divvy it up. Whoa! I just barely managed to throw myself back behind the tree as another wave of darkness hit the entire tree line. I heard a grunt a bit further down but couldn't tell whether Daria had been hit or not. I decided not to waste my time, swiveled back out and cast another combo of damage spells at the bear up front, enjoying the sight of the sonic wave taking the perfect route to hit all 3. In the meantime, my companions followed the plan, and a few grenades started to sail out through the night to hit the fighters in front. That'd be the clay bombs with the movement speed debuffs to slow down their approach. I decided to add insult to injury and quickly ran through the notes to a sonic push, causing Bertold to trip over his own feet and fall face first again. Clearly, that was tempting fate too much, because suddenly a dark fog settled over my shoulders and my entire body grew sluggish and tired. I could see an unknown icon blinking in the right-hand corner of my vision. Strength, perception, and agility decreased by 50%. Duration, 30 minutes. Gah, it was time to get moving. I shouted, "Move it, now! Don't stand still! Athel knows curses!" The first part of the trap had gone down swimmingly, apart from a few hiccups. The good thing was that whatever happened now, Athel's cover was officially blown since Gillum had agreed to watch the entire interaction hidden in the forest. Now, as for these hiccups, I counted one huge damn bear more than we expected, and the nosedive plus the curse, those we hadn't planned for. Part 2 was pretty simple for me, though. That's where the others were supposed to do all the hard work. While I was stumbling through the woods, cursing my current horrible balance and lack of strength, Lyle and Daria were retreating quickly, but taking the time to wear the enemies down little by little. Daria would be taking pot shots with her bow whenever the opportunity presented itself, and Lyle was equipped with all the clay bombs that caused bleeding damage. Hopefully, the flight through the woods would be enough to take down one of the 3, or at least leave them seriously debilitated. A few breathless minutes later, I found myself in another nearby clearing which was to be the center for the final part of our plan. I moved through the open space and placed myself yet again behind a tree on the far side and checked my health, which was down to about 60%. Behind me, the forest was alive with the sound of my companion's struggles, and I frantically worked to prepare myself as best I could. A minute or so later, Lyle stumbled into the clearing and hurried to the other side. He glanced at the three presences next to me, smiled, and said,
"I'm out of bombs, and so ready,"
while equipping his trusty mace and replacement shield, which was basically a couple of boards hammered together, reinforced with a metal band. Moments later, Daria came sprinting out of the woods with pursuit hot at her heels. Shadows were swirling around her from where she'd apparently also been cursed. If we'd named the three parts of our strategy, Part 3 would definitely be called The Stand. At this point, we'd hopefully weakened our enemies enough that a concentrated effort on our part could take them down. That, at least, was the theory. We'd soon see exactly what was going to happen in practice, as first the bear and then Bertold barged out of the forest, spent a moment to reorient themselves, and then ceaselessly followed Daria's form. Bertold was down to around 40% health and bleeding heavily from the ears. Apparently my initial sonic wave had managed to deafen him, and the bear was down to about a third left. Clearly its bulk had made for an inviting target in the close woods. It was the first opportunity I'd had to really take a look at the bear, and to my relief, it didn't look as massive as I'd originally pictured. At least it didn't rival the dire rat. Still, even debuffed, battered, and bleeding as it was, it remained a hulking, dirty brown creature with massive paws that'd likely be able to pound me into pulp in moments if it got a hold of me. I did notice that there were no shadowy patches on the bear. Hopefully this meant that Ethel had not had the chance to augment the animal. Ethel himself was nowhere to be seen. Either he was skulking in the shadows or his short legs had failed to keep up. I barely had time to whisper, "I stun them, and then we finish 'em off," to Lyle, before I had to raise my violin, and a stun blast erupted straight at them both. The bear plowed up a few meters of earth before coming to a trembling rest, and I stepped forward to continue my attack when I belatedly noticed that Bertold was still standing, and in fact, charging straight at me, twin axes at the ready. Lyle was running already, but he spotted my miscalculation and barely managed to move in front of me, deflecting the first attack. Normally, I'd have put even money on Lyle against Bertold, especially as beat up as he already was. But Bertold had clearly gone berserk, attacking with no regard for his health, and there was a constant keening sound emanating from his mouth. I yelled, "Lyle! Full defense! Everybody on Bertold!" I instantly added a mental command for my secret weapons to make themselves useful immediately. Instantly, the three shambling twine puppets I'd just activated erupted from the woods, staggering gracelessly after Bertold with sharp claws and lethal intentions. Bertold went down, hard, ugly, and bloody, just like the dwarf himself. I tried casting sleep on him, but berserk as he was, it didn't take. Our combined damage was simply too much for him to ignore, and in the end, he collapsed with an arrow sprouting from his chest. Nonetheless, he'd taken one of the puppets with him, and Lyle was now limping hard from where an axe had torn a long, bleeding gash into his lower leg. A split second after I'd ordered the remaining puppets to go for the bear that was just getting up, Ethel announced his presence with a wave of darkness that washed over Daria and me. I rapidly let loose a sonic missile and yelled, "Finish it already!" I instantly saw an arrow erupt from the animal's shoulder, and its health jumped down to about 10%. I'd just jumped back in safety behind a tree, expecting another wave of darkness, when I heard Ethel's voice cry out, "Enough!" And moments later, the entire clearing was shrouded in darkness. This was not complete "I can't see my own hand in front of me" darkness, but roiling shadows thick enough to obscure everything farther than a meter away. Basically, he'd just removed most of the effectiveness of 2/3 of our small team with one spell, and I was at a loss at how to proceed. Fortunately for me, my small brainless puppets had no such limitations, and moments later I could hear the bear whine from where one puppet had ostensibly managed to get in a lucky strike. A roar and 2 consecutive crunching sounds likely meant the destruction of both puppets, but it did provide me with some sound to aim by. I shot off a sonic wave blindly and prayed. A deafening roar, filled with fury and pain, covered the clearing, then silence, and eventually a dull thump. This was followed by a loud, wordless shout from Ethel from somewhere inside the clearing, followed by a complete lack of noise. I was back to standing behind the tree, listening in earnest for any hints as to where Ethel was, or for the shadows to dissipate, and used the time to summon the first of the remaining 3 puppets. If anything, the conditions seemed to worsen, and I had absolutely no idea where the others were. I felt convinced that we'd be able to take Ethel down, now that his support was gone. If only we'd be able to pin him down. Suddenly, Ethel's voice rang out again, from further away this time.
"Oh, Arcangelo, you rotten, cursed bastard of a reborn! You have no idea of the pain I'm going to cause you. As you have hurt mine, so I shall hurt yours. I will flay the—"
His monologue was rudely interrupted by the muted twang of an arrow being released and a loud cry. Nothing happened after that for a while, until a cry pierced the shadows, this time clearly from some distance.
"I will return for you in the name of Lion. I do so swear."
Minutes went by, and the fog finally lifted, and our battered party was left staring at each other. We'd made it, but Ethel had gotten away. We gathered in the clearing to discuss our situation and debated going after him while he was wounded, but concluded that hunting a shadow master at night on his home turf was a recipe for disaster. Eventually, we all returned to the tavern to talk, recuperate, and celebrate. Chapter 30. Time Off. We had crashed fairly early the day before. The night's developments had left all 3 of us physically and emotionally exhausted. And Gillum had been gracious enough to provide Daria with lodging for the night, after we'd explained everything that had happened at least 3 times. Well, Daria had to tell her part at least 5 times due to how amazing it was. While Lyle and I had been hiding behind trees, allowing Ethel to have at it with target practice and monologues, Daria had immediately dropped to the ground and started slowly creeping to the other side of the clearing, making sure to stay just inside the trees. Once she was certain she'd made it without Ethel noticing, mostly due to the fact that she could hear his spells hitting the other side, she'd closed her eyes and started just taking in everything with her other senses. The sound of Ethel's angry monologues, the very faint smell of the dead bear overlaid by the ozone-like smell of waves of unleashed magic. Eventually, even the sound of footsteps. In the end, all these inputs combined to give her a sense of where Ethel was standing. She rose and shot in one moment, and a miracle of miracles hit him right in the back with a special attack. She told me afterwards that she'd even gained an achievement which looked like a precursor to actual blind fighting, allowing her to better rely on her other senses if she couldn't see. The day after was a day of talking. Debriefings, meetings, impromptu gatherings, gossip mongers demanding their due and friendly conversations. Whatever the moniker, our group spent half the day explaining what had happened to pretty much everybody over and frigging over again. I managed to grab a couple of minutes to myself outside the council's chamber to go through pop-ups of the day before, and I enjoyed what I saw. My spells had received some nice increases, and both my unarmored dodge and leadership skills had leveled. Blackmail and diplomacy had both increased from the hilltop conversation. Weird combination, but I'd take it. Even my acrobatic skill had gained a point from my downhill shenanigans. I'd gained a grand total of 280 experience points, 150 from Bertold and 130 from the bear. This was only about a third of what his former pet had granted. Good thing Ethel hadn't had the time or sacrificial opportunities to buff his pet further, or we'd have been royally screwed. Ethel himself, of course, netted us absolutely nothing since he'd gotten away. I'd received a pop-up that was bitter but undeniably fair. You have failed the quest, convincing the conniving. While you did eventually figure out who the culprit behind the attacks was, the Garterson brothers managed to make a fool out of you and convince you that Sourpuss was the demonologist. Penalty? Minus 1,000 reputation with Grant's Crossing. New reputation? 1,125. Liked. As for loot, the bear had provided a number of items which I was already looking forward to tinkering with, and Bertold, well, I just couldn't quite bring myself to frisking his corpse right in front of the eyes of the others. I did take his hand axes with me, seeing as he'd just tried to kill us all. I was aware that it might look like I was losing sight of the fact that this was a game. It was just the sheer thought of rummaging through the clothes of the very lifelike personage I'd been talking to just hours earlier had me beat. It was easier when you were hunting monsters or something less human. There was one final pop-up, and I wasn't entirely sure what to think about it yet. You have earned an achievement. The ends justify the means. You have proven that you are willing to go to extraordinary and even amoral lengths to get to the bottom of what you believe to be the truth. People know and respect that you are a man who gets results, but dislike the methods that you tend to use. Any positive reputation gain is increased by 20%, but negative reputation is increased by 40%. In the end, I made the conscious decision to regard it as a good thing. Almost all the reputation I'd gained so far had been positive, and judging by my results so far, the gain would be much higher than any potential losses. I'd just have to avoid another incident like the one with the mayor or Lyle suddenly dying on me, or this could land me in serious bad karma in one fell blow. When the council was done with this final session, however, the mood changed. In order to corroborate our stories, they'd had both the Blood Brothers and Ethel's home searched, and they'd uncovered everything. Items confirmed to be from caravans that had disappeared, Ethel's summoning paraphernalia, and books, and the most important part, a barely breathing, horribly scarred and injured Herbert Garterson, who readily admitted to everything. In his own words, Herbert had reached the limit of what he would participate in and had said no, and Ethel had interpreted that as him wanting to expose their secrets and rewarded him accordingly. Supposedly, the only reason he was still alive was that Ethel had wanted to finish the session properly after he was done with us. While I didn't have that much experience with the council, I had to grant them this. They were a pragmatic bunch. Once blame had been properly placed with the guilty parties, the discussions were cut off, except for Herbert's fate, which still remained to be decided. And they immediately freed Sourpuss, declared all work to be cancelled, and for the day to be a day of celebrations for the entire village. Mallard saw me off, offering me to have fun, and gave me my reward for helping out the village. Congratulations, you have completed the quest, Digging Deeper. You figured out that Ethel Bellaris was the mastermind behind the suppression on the trade caravans, and was told what happened to the caravans afterwards. Reward, 500 experience points. Plus 1,000, plus 20% equals 1,200, reputation with Mallard Bullhop. New reputation, 2,825. Liked. Plus 500, plus 20% equals 600, reputation with Grant's Crossing. New reputation, 1,725. Liked. 1 gold. Simultaneously, I received my first indication that Saroon might be the right choice for me. Improved standing with Saroon. You have fought hard to uncover hidden truths inside the village of Grant's Crossing, and have also laid the groundwork for a proper grudge for the years to come. Reward. Uncovering an old, well-hidden secret, 500 clergy points. Establishing the basis of a grudge, 200 clergy points. 1 gold. All right, the part where I was rewarded for creating an enemy was pretty disturbing, but the rest went pretty well with my chronicler class. Now, if anybody were to look back at the last week or so, they'd probably be justified in claiming that I was getting a bit too invested in the game. The decisions I'd made were not really in sync with how I initially wanted to spend my time in-game, and a lot of my choices were based entirely on the personalities of the people in the game instead of relying on game logic or even proper economic sense. I would like to address these hypothetical persons, however, and state, walk a mile in these shoes, and tell me I was wrong. Have an impassioned and inebriated late-night discussion with Gillum about which is better, light or dark beer, and tell me again that he's just an NPC. Better yet, walk the muddy streets of Grant's Crossing when the entire village is completely occupied celebrating a feast in your honor, and tell me it wasn't worth it. I friggin' dare you. I did walk those streets, and I took it all in, loving every moment. I played and sang with whoever was around, ate and drank with people of all races and ages, and was overwhelmed with embarrassment from all the hugs, kisses, and gratitude I received from people I'd never even talked to before. At some point after dinner, the rumors spread like wildfire that the council was throwing a huge celebratory feast in the town square in the evening, and they were even setting up tables and a stage and having Gillum arrange whatever delicacies money could buy. Not only that, but everybody was helping. Throwing in some homebrew, producing a few family recipes for the tables, or putting together small groups to rehearse songs or plays, or just adding some color to the picture by getting hopelessly drunk over the afternoon. Gillum and I also cooked up our own entertainment. He egged me on to create some song to celebrate the triumph over evil, his words, not mine, and after a couple of pints, his arguments started making a lot of sense to me. I came up with the notion of inviting Navis to sing the song while I played to make the end result even better. Gillum sent Jeb running to fetch her, and when they returned, she needed little incentive to help. The next few hours were spent laughing, drinking, playing, and fiddling with the words. The melody, well, I stole that one hands down. The day flew by. Speeches were held, and the evening's celebratory feast consumed along with an entirely unhealthy amount of alcohol. Suddenly I found myself on stage late in the evening, playing before the collected masses of the village. I'd never realized that there were so many of them, while Navis sang along.
The heroine of Grant's Crossing. The demon spawn surveyed our village, said this will do fine for my lair. I'm off now to kill, steal, and pillage, pluck 'em bald, save maybe one hair. She'd been beaten once, yet she strode out again, stood firm in the path of both demons and men. Her eyes full of fire against foes vile and black. She did not rest once till she paid 'em all back. Years and years our villain was hiding, decimating our bravest and best. Out of nowhere the half-orc came striding, and the dark knave was put to the test. She'd been beaten once, yet she strode out again, stood firm in the path of both demons and men, her eyes full of fire against foes vile and black. Her first fight was lost, yet she'd pay 'em all back. Once the miscreants had been uncovered, our bard talked them into a fight. Nearby half-orc and warrior hovered. Soon the two forces clashed in the night. She'd been beaten once, yet she strode out again, stood firm in the path of both demons and men, her eyes full of fire against foes vile and black. She gave it her all till she paid them all back. In full darkness, the villain stood talking, said, "You failed, now I'll put you to rest." While our heroine slowly came stalking, and her arrow shot into his chest. She'd been beaten once, yet she strode out again, stood firm in the path of both demons and men, her eyes full of fire against foes vile and black. She saved all our lives with her final attack.
Bravo! Bravo!
When we'd finished, the audience exploded in a thunderous applause, and we were immediately asked to sing it again. This time I got caught up in the sound of Navis's voice and almost bungled up a couple of notes. And when I started concentrating properly again, I had to admit that the result was pretty damn spectacular. The song itself wasn't half bad, and coupled with her voice, we'd likely have the remainder of the village humming the tune in the days to come. At some point later on, our heroine made an appearance, emerging from the crowd with 2 cups of something and a lopsided smile on her face. She handed off one of the cups to me and moved closer to be heard over the crowd.
Very impressive singing, and a rather grandiose telling of my exploits.
I shrugged. Yeah, well, they needed a win and could do with a hero. And what you did was pretty damn heroic. Up close, I once again couldn't help but notice how extraordinarily attractive Daria was, regardless of the tusks and skin color. Her high cheekbones, full lips, and golden eyes seemed to drag me in closer. She said,
Thanks a lot, Arcangelo. Nobody has ever called me a hero before.
She looked down. Was she blushing? It actually looked like she was blushing, and moved closer to me. Her close presence was almost intoxicating, and I barely noticed what was happening, until in one flowing motion, she poured the contents of her cup over my head, tripped me, and caused me to keel over, and the next thing I knew, my head slammed into the ground, and I was blinking away a pop-up about non-lethal damage. She beamed a feral grin at me, baring her tusks and teeth.
Of course, putting your song to the tune of the Hero of Canton changes the impression quite a bit, you cocky bastard.
Walking away, she yelled over her shoulder,
Also, dwarves and ratlings aren't men. Your writing is horrible.
While she walked away, I called out, Oh, come on! I had to make a song about a hero and I just couldn't get the tune out of my head. It's so damn catchy. I rested my head on the ground again to make the earth stop spinning, and a moment later I could see Gillam's head obscure my view of the sky.
So, hanging out, I see?
His wide grin was infectious. Nah, I'm busy. I've been told I need to work on my people skills. This is me working. Or learning at least. Today I've learned that if you want to name somebody a hero, you'd better accompany it to a tune that wasn't originally about someone very, very unheroic. Inwards, I couldn't help thinking, she even knows her firefly. Damn. Gillam snorted.
Don't quit your day job, Archie. Oh, and about that.
He gave me a hand up.
There's something I've been meaning to discuss with you. Now, I know you're aiming to get the hell out of here, find some large place filled to the brim with loose women and make your name there, but I want to grant you an alternative. How about staying here as the official bard in Grant's Crossing? Hear me out, my friend. I know you don't want to be limited to this place, but what's the rush? The rest of the world will still be there half a year from now, and until then, well, people here are growing somewhat fond of you. Even Kif only tries to strangle you half the time, and your playing is starting to sound halfway decent.
Congratulations. You have completed the quest, Entertainment for the Masses. You have kept the good people of Grant's Crossing entertained for an acceptable period of time and have been offered a choice of rewards. Reward A. Become the official bard of Grant's Crossing. Reputation with Grant's Crossing increased by 1,000, plus 20% equals 1,200. New reputation, 2,925. Liked. Universal reputation increased by 250, plus 20% equals 300. New reputation, 550 out of 1,000. Entirely unknown. Additional quest lines become available. Reward B. Universal reputation increased by 250, plus 20% equals 300. New reputation, 550 out of 1,000. Entirely unknown. Choose between a selection of items from Gillam's personal stash. The words, "What's the rush?" stayed with me. I'd had a couple of reasons for wanting to leave, but the foremost had been the fear of getting bored and lacking something to do. And looking back at the last couple of weeks, if anything, I had too many interesting odds and ends to look into. Also, I had trouble imagining myself finding as good and eager teachers as I had in Grant's Crossing. And while the audience might not always be polished, refined, or even clean, they were as enthusiastic and authentic as I could ever hope for. And with the way things were evolving while I was around, I'd probably be embroiled in an all-out war before long. I put an arm around Gillem's shoulder and guided him towards the nearest beer cask. Gillem, I feel I need more information from you. This upgrade should of course come with my own valet and personal waiter, right? He barked with laughter.
Good one. I'm already losing money from our arrangements with how much you're eating. Shouldn't you stiff ears be eating only shoots or bark or something like that?
I think you forgot the half in half-elf. That means only half of me is a stoic, wise, eternal being living in a pact with nature. The other half is quite all right with eating meat and slapping impudent gnomes. Like this. Our banter continued, but for once I had a pop-up that I didn't want to minimize right away. You have accepted the role as the official bard of Grant's Crossing. I had a feeling that this could be the start of something wonderful. You have been listening to The Wayward Bard, World of Chains, Book 1, written by Lars M., narrated by Justin Thomas James, featuring Laurie Catherine Winkel as Daria, Mrs. Bertinka, and the rest of the female cast, and Jeff Hayes as Gillem Drizzlefog, Grek, and other supporting characters. Proofing by Dalton Lynn. Music arrangement, sound design, editing, and mastering by Justin Thomas James. Violin performed by Michelle Odorico. Music sound engineering by Kevin Odorico. Copyright 2018 by Lars M. Production copyright 2018 by Lars M. A Sound Booth Theater production. To stay up to date on our upcoming audiobooks, sign up for our newsletter at soundbooththeater.com. Produced in cooperation with Spoken Realms on the web at spokenrealms.com. Thank you for listening.